Kodesh Baruch Hu should protect us, B'Sech Klal Yisrael, and all of mankind, all of Yidden, alle Yidden.
Amen. Amen.
Okay, das ist das Satz me Maves. Sein gut. Okay, we're going to discuss a topic today. I just want to share just the personal Matan Torah with all the Yidden we're learning tonight. That is, just like all the Yidden were Mekabel the Torah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Klal Yisrael the Torah, we were Mekabel the Torah. I had a personal Kabbalah Torah from the Sarah Torah. That is Mamish and Yom Matan Torah. I received 2 new Svarim, Baruch Hashem, on the day of Matan Torah, from the Sarah Torah, from the Rogatchover Gaon, which was never ever published before, from manuscript. And I believe I will share a section of a shtickle Torah from him, found there also in another Svarim of his. And I believe tonight's shir, we will be the first ones globally, universally, to learn the shtickle Torah, because no one has yet seen the Svarim, because no one can go to the stores to buy it, and they can't send it overseas because there's no freight and there's no deliveries. But B'Nissen, Baruch Hashem, I have it. So I'll call Purim, sharing is caring, so we'll share. And everybody should have a good experience and be inspired with Matan Torah throughout the year, to be nischazik and limud that Torah. Okay, amen va'amen. The topic we will discuss tonight is a topic which is topical. Firstly, we say it every day in our tefillahs. We say the Birchas Kohanim daily, even the Chutz La'aretz. Even in Chutz La'aretz, the Ashkenazim, even if they're not, we don't have the Nesias Kapayim daily, nevertheless, we say the Birchas Kohanim and the Birchas HaShachar daily. Why? Because after you say the Birchas HaTorah, you have to say Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh. So there's a novel tshuva, I don't recall it often, this is just a saying on the top of my head. There's a novel tshuva in Tshuva's Eretz Tzvi from the Kojic Lovarov. It was a Ram and Chachme Lublin, for those who heard of it. It was Man Rebbe Zarebe, that Arav Pekarsky, all of Shalom's Rebbe, our Rebbe Zarebe, our Rosh Yeshiva Zarebe. I'll call upon him. He says he has a novel beer on why they chose Dafka Birchas Kohanim to be said. Besides that, it's a bracha, but we could have chosen any parsha of Torah to say after Birchas HaTorah and the Birchas HaShachar. And they chose Dafka, the Birchas Kohanim, and I think he's masber because the Birchas Kohanim have a gather of Torah Shebiksav and also of Torah Shebal Peh. That's why, because the Kohanim didn't say read from a Siddur. The Kohanim didn't read from a Sefer Torah. They said the Birchas Kohanim Bal Peh. Even though Torah Shebiksav, he can't say Bal Peh. I'll call upon him. So I think he has a sabir. I don't recall offhand. Okay, how many times do I have to say I don't recall? I'll call upon him. So it should be there. That's why. So Birchas Kohanim we say daily, even for the Ashkenazim who don't actually do them daily. The Sfardim definitely do daily, even Chutz La'aretz and Eretz Yisrael. You do them daily for depending where you are and depending if you're a Chabadsker or not in Yerushalayim or in the other cities. And after in Yerushalayim or HaKodesh, I understand everybody do them daily. But B'chol those who didn't have a chance in Chutz La'aretz to duchen because they were in lockdown on Pesach, but Baruch Hashem, the restrictions eased, and many Yidden were in shul and were zoicha to have a Birchas Kohanim and a Siyas Kapayim, and Geduchent, and as Toisif says in Masechta Sotah, as the time of Birchas Kohanim is an Eis Rotzen, not Toisif. I haven't seen the Achronim bring it to Toisif. I talk like I know what I'm talking about, but Toisif says that that the Zman of Birchas Kohanim of Nesias Kapayim in Shul is an Eis Rotzen. Also steht in Toisvis, sind nicht kein Kabbalah Sefer, und sind nicht von Epes Rebbe, steht in Toisvis an Eis Rotzen. That's the reason why there's Hatovas Cholam at the time, etc., etc. Zalkol Ponim, so surely the Eis Rotzen will bring brocha for Klal Yisrael and alle Hinsichten. So that's another reason why Birchas Kohanim is a topical topic. We're coming from Yom Tov Shavuos, also in Parshas Nosoi. The Parsha of Birchas Kohanim, Nesias Kapayim, the tzivur for the Kohanim to be Mevorach Ha'am, is found in this week. Baruch Hashem Yishmerecha. It's in this week's Parsha, in Parshas Nosoi. For the Bnei Chutz La'aretz, we're going to read the Parshas Nosoi the coming week. I believe the Bnei Chutz La'aretz read already Parshas Nosoi the Pei Shabbos. I believe so, right? Because it wasn't Yom Tov. Keiner sagt nicht, jetzt nicht. Yes. Okay, yes. So we're mamish in between. We're sandwiched in, Baruch Hashem, between the Bnei Eretz Yisrael and the Chutz La'aretz. So we're going to address Parshas Nosoi.
Shaila was whether we should say Pirkei Avos or not. That was the Shaila.
Okay, if you're not sure, say it. Sit in the shatten. Okay, and I'm mute. Okay, all good. Shkoyach. And before I'm weiter. Und Hecht. Bald were coming from Yemei Asvira, and the Rebbe, Lubavitcher Rebbe advises and asks, requests that we should learn Masechta Soita, Chassidei Chabad, and many others being learned Masechta Soita in the Yemei Asvira, so they were made a sim on Masechta Soita on Erev Shavuos. So B'meila we're coming from the Masechta Soita, where the Iker Sugya of Birchas Kohanim and the Siyas Kapayim is in the Mishnah and in the Gemara Masechta Soita. So we don't need excuses why we're talking about this topic. But whatever the case is, it all comes together, and therefore it's all the different reasons only compound the power and the strength and the might of the bracha. Now let's go on. Please be so kind. I hope you all received, by the way, the sheet, the Rambam, which Rabbi Menshi Schneier posted. So you all have that. But before anything, please take out your chumashim. I should have told you in advance. Let's take out your chumash for a moment. Not for a moment. Take out a chumash and take out a chumash dvorim. We need a chumash dvorim, not a parshas nossi, but dafka a chumash dvorim. Because we are going to discuss the inyan of Bal Toisif in Birchas Kohanim. Bal Toisif, the lav of Lois Sifu in Birchas Kohanim. And the reason we call it Bal Toisif, we know many lavin of the Torah, we say like Bal Tashchis, Bal Tigra, Bal Toisif. Bal means not to, like in Aramaic, it means Bal means loy. But what's wrong with the holy tongue, the holy lashon of the Torah, loy seisifu, v'loy sigru? Nevertheless, we find it throughout that we use the lashon Bal. I won't share this with you, and maybe you're aware of it. Whatever the case is, I'll say it again. I'll try not to take up too much time. So dafke, this is found. Yeah, I saw it. This Dei Chemed in Erech Bal Toisif quotes from the Sefer Yalkut HaGershuni. Yeah, Yalkut HaGershuni, a choshev a Sefer on Klolim, and also Ala Torah and on Agodas Hashas, and also on Shulchan Aruch. Yalkut HaGershuni. If you don't have it, get it. It's choshev. I'll call upon him. One of the Ungarish Gedolei Yisrael. So the Yalkut HaGershuni on the Erech Bal Toisif quotes the Hagdama, the preface of Rabbi Shaya Pika, Rabbi Shaya Berlin, who was one of the Gedolei Yisrael who corresponded with the Noda B'Yehuda, and knew Kol HaTorah Kula. So in his preface to the Sefer Tishbi, he asks the question. He asks why we find that throughout the Shas, and when we refer to the different lavin, we don't say loy seisif or loy sigru. We say dafka loy toisif. We don't say loy seisif. We say bal tashchis, bal tigra. And he asks, he mamash enumerates all the different lavin where we find that we refer to them with the lashon Baal, which Baal would mean in Aramaic don't, but we don't use the lashon kodesh, the Hebrew language. And he says that in a certain sefer of his, he will explain it. The fact is that I'm almost sure that sefer, which he refers to, is not available today, or was never published or whatever. So I'll call upon him. That's all this Chemed records. He doesn't explain it, and he remains with the question. But if I recall, if I recall correctly, I don't recall who says it. But to my knowledge, the beer is as follows. The reason why we say Bal Toisif and we don't say Loy Toisif. And this is connected to Matan Torah. We know the Rabbonim get Aseres Adibros, right? And the reason, I don't know why the Rabbanim get Aseres Adibros, the Pashtas, because Aseres Adibros is very special, the Rabbanim are special. But we have to realize in the Aseres Adibros, we have many, when the Aseres Adibros, it says, Loy Sirtzach, Loy Sinov, Loy Signov, it says all the different inyanim with the Loy. So there's the known word of Chidush Harim, which Lamaisa B'Poil is Enikal, the Imriyanis, together, Rebbe's Chusayel and Aleinu, is Yortzit with Shavuos. So the Chidush Harim, there's a word brought in the name of Chidush Harim. That the Chidush Harim asks, why did there have to be such a miracle? That the Matan Torah, it was Royines Anishma V'Shoimines Anira. They heard what is generally seen, and they saw what is generally heard. Because if they would have heard Aseres Adibros, and Hashem or Moshe Rabbeinu says Loy Signoiv, Loy Sirtzach, and they wouldn't have seen the letters, they would have maybe thought that the Loy is mitavov. The Loy Sirtzach is with a Vav, and the Loy Sinov is with a Vav, and the Loy Signov is with a Vav. They wouldn't realize that the Loy is with an Aleph. And that's what they used to say. There's an expression of our Malamdim who used to say, Loy mit an Aleph. Which Malamdim used to say. I recall my Rebbe used to say that to me. Loy mit an Aleph. Meaning, when you say Loy, you're not sure if it's with an Aleph or a Vav. The Mela therefore says the Chidush Harim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to royin es anishmi, had to show them the letters that when Hashem says Lor Sitzach, He meant loy mit an aleph, nicht loy mit avov. So those that get the aliyas are very lucky because they see it mefurish. In the Aseres Adibris, it says loy mit an aleph. It doesn't say loy mit avov, and then you make hagba. So those who to come close to the Sefer Torah, they will also see and be zeicha to see the loy that's shoymin es anira, it's roy es anishma, and they will see the loy is mit an aleph. And that may be the hezber. I recall seeing it somewhere. That's the hezber where we say Bal Tashkis or Bal Tigra or Bal Toisif. It would say Loy Toisif. You wouldn't know if it's maybe an aleph or a vav. It says Loy Sigra. You wouldn't know if it's an aleph or a vav, right? Etc. Just like we explained before. Therefore, it was the Loshen, the Chazal wanted to convey the message that it's Taka Alav. Therefore, they said, they conveyed it in a very clear, explicit way, that it's Bal Toisif. We should know that there's a prohibition, Seloi Mitan Aleph. And we're moving on. So we're discussing the inyan of Bal Toisif in relation to Birchas Kohanim. But let's just a short introduction. I don't want to call it an introduction because then people have issues that the introduction takes up too much time of the shir. It's just leading us into the shir. And that is, in Parshas, we find the Loy Toisif, Loy Soisifu, Loy Sikru. Right? You shouldn't add and you shouldn't subtract from the mitzvahs. We find it twice in the Chumash. Once we find it in Parshas Vayeschanan. So if you have a Chumash Devorim, for those who need to translate, like we just finished touching up the Loi, so the translation of Devorim, the way it's translated is Deuteronomy. And we explained already, Deuteronomy means repeat. That's what they said in Latin or whatever. Because the Torah, that's Mishnah Torah, it's recording and repeating what the first four Chumash are saying. So please be so kind and take out a Parshas Vayeschanan. In Kapitel Dalet, there it says in Kapitel Dalet, Pasuk Beis, Lo Soisifu al Hadover, Asher Anochi Mitzvah Eschem, Lo Sigru Mimenu, Nishmer es Mitzvahs Hashem Elokeichem, Asher Anochi Mitzvah Eschem. So it says not to add on the mitzvahs and not to subtract from the mitzvahs. And this is not especially applicable after Matan Torah, where the Gemara, this is brought in the Ba'arucha, it's explained. In Shailas Tshuvas Binyan Shlomo for Rab Shlomo Lemivilna and Chelik Beis, in a new Chelik, which was published in the last many years, compiled from different Tshuvas and different Hamlotzes, which he's written, published in Yonim from the Binyan Shlomo. And the Chelik Beis in the Yonim Shoinim in Simin Yodalad, he has an arichis how it's connected to Torah Tziva Lonu Moshe. Marosha Kelos Yankov, the Gemara in Masechta Baka says Torah b'gematria Tov Reish Yud Aleph. So Tov Reish Yud Aleph, it's Tziva Lonu Moshe. And what about Taryag? We know this Taryag. So the Gemara says, Onoichi the first two dibros HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, and Torah Tziva Lonu Moshe, Moshe Rabbeinu told us the numerical value of Torah, which is Tov Reish Yud Aleph. And the other two, Hashem said it b'pi Agvura Shomanu. Actually, so the Rav Shlomo Lemivilna explains that the Tov Reish Yud Aleph, what's in addition to the Tov Reish Yud Aleph? These are the two lavin of V'lo Sisif and V'lo Sigru. You get it? In other words, there's the mitzvahs of the Torah, the positive mitzvahs, and the negative mitzvahs altogether, that Tov Reish Yud Aleph. Then there are another two lavin of the Torah, which one lav, one prohibition, one transgression is Lo Sisifu, one transgression Lo Sigru. And because these two lavin substantiate the whole Torah and is the upkeep of the whole Torah, so that's why it doesn't come is not incorporated, it's not comprised in the Torah Tziva Lonu Moshe. Because these come, so to speak, to support the Torah Tziva Lonu Moshe. How do we support it? By this, that we don't add and we don't subtract. Take a look at Shuvas Binyan Shlomo, Chelik Beis, Simin Yudalad in the Yonim Shoinim. He has a nice discussion on this matter. So that's the first pasuk in Parshas Vayeschanan. The second pasuk, and that is in Parshas Re'eh, also in Chumash Dvorim, and that is in the Chumash Dvorim you will find in Kapitel Yud Gimel, Kapitel, the 13th Kapitel, the 13th Perik. If you don't like the word Kapitel, I don't know why you don't like it. If you didn't go to Cheder, you don't know what Kapitel means. But if you went to Yeshiva and to Cheder, we always said Kapitel. Okay, you don't like Kapitel, say Perik. Okay, say Perik or chapter. So it's Eis, it says in Kapitel Yud Gimel, Pasuk Aleph, it says Eis Kol Hadover, Asher Anochi Mitzvah Eschem Moisei Shishmeru Lasos, so there you have another Bal Toisif. Now there's the known Pirush from the Vilna Gaon in his Sefer Aderes Eliyahu, which says as follows. So what's the difference? And he asks, why is the need of the repetition? And he explains that the difference between the one in Parshas Vayeschanan and the one in Parshas Re'eh is as follows. there are two modes and fashions, two different ways how to transgress the Leisei Sifu and the Leisiguru. And that is, we can take the one mitzvah, right? For instance, there are 4 parshas in the Tefillin, and you're adding a 5th parsha. There are 4 tzitziyos, and you're adding a 5th tzitzah. There are 3 psukim in Birchas Kohanim, and you're adding a 4th. So that transforms, in other words, that seems to add, you're adding on to the individual mitzvah. There's an individual change in that specific mitzvah. If you have only 3 parshas of the Tefillin, or you have only 3 tzitzis, or you have only 2 brachas. So that's the leisigru in the specific mitzvah. Then you have also, there's a leisigru and leisigru in the general number of mitzvahs, and that is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, we should have only these amount of mitzvahs, Taryag mitzvahs, like the Gemara says in Makkos, no more and no less. And therefore, there is Shiramach mitzvah says 248 positive mitzvahs, Shasalo says 365 negative mitzvahs, and therefore, Yeravim Benevot, who wanted to be Mechadish, a mitzvah, Shabodo Milibo, he is regarded as Yeravim Benevot. In other words, those who make up new mitzvahs, new inyanim, new chagim, so that's adding onto the mitzvahs, or God forbid, you don't fulfill one of the mitzvahs of the Torah, in other words, with intent to subtract, minimize from the mitzvahs, so the one relates to the general number of the mitzvahs, by adding new styles as types of modes of inyanim of mitzvahs, or new mitzvahs in general, or new chagim. And that's why we need a special heter. Why HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, as the Rambam explains in the Hagdama in Mishnah Torah, after he enumerates the mitzvahs, and as he explains also in the Hilchos Mamrim, the heter for the Chachamim to add mitzvahs like Purim and Chanukah, etc., is because they didn't say we're adding onto the Torah, it's their own thing, etc. So there's no Bal Toisif. The Rambam elaborates. Let's move on. Because of the Vilna Gaon wants to say that in Parshas Rei we're talking about the specific mitzvahs. In Parshas Rei is the specific mitzvahs, and he brings the Sifri. With the Sifri in Parshas Rei makes it very clear that we're talking about the specific mitzvahs. And that is not to add to transform the mitzvah of Tefillin. If it's 4 parshas, it has to remain 4. The tzitzis don't change that, don't change from that mitzvah. If it's 4 tzitzis, you can't change it to 5. And there too, it says about the Birchas Kohanim that it's 3 brachas, you can't add another bracha. So talking about the specific mitzvah, the adding and the subtracting within the specific mitzvah. Mashenk in the Birchas Kohanim, there it's addressing the general mitzvah. And that is, in other words, a general number of mitzvahs. You have no right to add new mitzvahs or subtract from the general number of the mitzvahs or add new holidays and new Yom Tovim. And he explains it in the context of a pasuk. He says that's when Birchas Kohanim it says, "V'ata Yisrael Shema Lachukim V'Ala Mishpotim." We're talking about the general number of mitzvahs. Hashem speaks in general. You have to keep all the mitzvahs, and there HaKadosh Baruch Hu in sequence says, "Don't add and don't subtract." We're talking about the general number. She'enkin over here in Parshas Rei, we're talking about the specific mitzvahs. This is what the Vilna Gaon says, and the fact is, the Vilna Gaon, that's his pirush. And interestingly, Dafka, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, what's the difference, Dafka? I'm sorry that I said Dafka. It's totally out of hand. Yes, the Lubavitcher Rebbe is Chusay Yogan Oleinu, who brings the Bir Agro, or Biurim from the Gro, frequently throughout the Likutei Sichos for those who have their Likutei Sichos in their safe deposit box, or in the back room, so you can open up, or under the desk, so you can open up your Likutei Sichos and see that throughout the 39 volumes, the Rebbe references the Biurei Agro. And for those who wouldn't open a Likutei Sichos because they're not sure the Rebbe would reference a Biurei Agro, let me let you know, and it's not a secret, he mentions Biurei Agro. So if that's what allows you and makes you feel comfortable to open a Likutei Sichos, open a Likutei Sichos. Whoever doesn't like what I just said can ignore it and delete it. Whoever appreciates it can tap me on the back. We're moving on. It is unusual, I think, that he quotes the Aderes Eliyahu. That's quite a chiddush, and I don't know how frequent or often he brings it, but he brings the Aderes Eliyahu, and he dafka says that the pirush of the Vilna Gaon is found dafka by one of the Rishonim. I haven't seen others bringing this support for the Vilna Gaon, but the Rebbe says in the Sefer Psikta Zutrasi from Rab Tuvia Rabbi Eliezer, who was one of the Gdolei Harishonim. Many think that it's a medrash because it's called Psikta Zutrase, but and it's called Medrash Lekach Tov. Lamaisa Bapoli was a Rishon. He was before the Rambam, and some even say Rabbi Avram Berliner queries that there's a possibility to say that maybe even the Rambam used it and sourced different information dafka from the Medrash Lekach Tov. Now is not time to discuss because we'll never finish. It's already 10 to 9. Okay, so the Rebbe says if we'll take a look at the Medrash Lekach Tov in Parshas Vayeschanan and take a look at the Medrash Lekach Tov, the Sikta Zutrus in Parshas Re'eh, you will see he says the Pirush as the Vilna Gaon says. If the Vilna Gaon had the Sikta Zutrus, I don't know, and it's not relevant. I'll go upon him, so it matches up eye to eye with the Vilna Gaon, so it's wonderful support for what the Vilna Gaon says. The biggest pella is as follows, and this is Dafke the Aderes from Ponavish and Mir, and then was Elul Yerushalayim, the great Aderes. He wrote many Svarim, so he's in his Sefer Cheshboinei Shel Mitzvah in Mitzvah Tov Nun Dalet. That's the mitzvah count, the number in Sefer HaChinuch where he counts in Parshas Re'eh, in the mitzvah of the law of Bal Toisif and Bal Tigra. So Bal Toisif, so there the Cheshboinei Shel Mitzvah brings the Pirush of the Vilna Gaon, and he says, listen to what he says. I have him before the Gemara. It says Fakert from the Vilna Gaon. The Gemara says in Masechta Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis, and that's the Gemara which we're going to focus on tonight. The Gemara says in Masechta Rosh Hashanah as follows. Let me read for you the Gemara in Masechta Rosh Hashanah. That's basically the source of the Rambam you have in front of you. The Gemara says as follows. Listen, please pay attention to what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, Mosiv Rav Shemen Barabba. The Rabbi Hanan has a different gears of the name, but it's all the same. Minayin lekoyin she'ola leduchen shelo yomar. A koyin who was ola to duchen. Question is if this is referring to the Beis Hamikdash. That's why it says the lashon ola leduchen. Some want to say it's referring to the Beis Hamikdash as it says in Kleichem and Parshas in Chumash Dvorim, and also Rav Hutner in the Sefer HaZikaron for Pachad Yitzchak. Pachad Yitzchak, he published by Machon Yerushalayim. He also wants to, and also published by his Koil Chaim Berlin, whatever, the Coney Island Avenue. If you were never there, you can visit it. It's a nice place. I don't know if you're a Lubavitcher, you should tell them you're a Lubavitcher because they'll throw you out on your head for some odd reason. Nevertheless, you don't like the sound of that either, I know. Okay, so you'll delete it if you don't like the sound of it. But so in there he says, Rav Hutner also has a whole issue there, and he claims that the Lashon Eila Leduchen is talking about the Beis Hamikdash, but it's not Mucharach. It can also be discussing our Duchening, as we call it Duchening, because in the Beis Hamikdash it was talking about Duchening, especially in the Sifri, the way it says in the Sifri, it doesn't say the Lashon Eila Leduchen. So this din in Sifri, Parshas Re'eh, is lav dafka in the Beis Hamikdash, and listen to the din. Shelo Yomer, one shouldn't say, Hoyel v'nos nali Torah Rishus levarach es Yisrael. The Kohen shouldn't say, V'bal HaKadosh Baruch gave me Rishus to bench Eden. Oisev bracha achas mishali, I will add a bracha of my own. Kigoin what bracha Hashem Elokei Avisechem Yosef Aleichem. Right? He'll add the bracha which Moshe Rabbeinu blessed the Klal Yisrael in the beginning of Chumash Dvorim. Talmud Loimar. It's therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu says in the Torah, Lo Yisifo ala dovar. You have no right to add any brachas. So from here we derive that you're not allowed to watch. So this is quoted, like I say here in Masechta Rosh Hashanah, and also quoted there in the Sifri and Parshas Re'eh. Take a look at the pasuk quoted. Now we're talking about changing the mode of the specific mitzvah. We're talking about a specific mitzvah of Birchas Kohanim, correct? The Siyas Kapayim. It has to have 3 brachas. He wants to add a 4th bracha. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Lo Toisif, according to the Vilna Gaon, which pasuk should have been quoted in the Shas? The pasuk of Parshas Re'eh, where there it says Lo Toisif, singular, right? And Dafka, what's quoted in Masechta Rosh Hashanah, the pasuk Lo Toisifu, which is in Parshas Vayeschanan. Says the Aderes, this pasuk doesn't seem to coincide with the Vilna Gaon. I'm a foolish Gemara Fakert from the Vilna Gaon. So would you believe what he does? I'll tell you in a minute what he does. He employs the sheet of the Vilna Gaon. Everybody knows very well, whoever's been listening to these series of shiurim for the last many years, everybody knows the sheet of the Vilna Gaon. The sheet of the Vilna Gaon is that if something doesn't work out well, and you have no rational analysis or explanation, you have right to be magia the text. And that's exactly what the Aderes does. He says, and he's in the eyes of the Aderes, the Vilna Gaon is taka holy, and he refers to him as mamash murder dikalashonis. You would think that it's like a Lubavitcher referring to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but no, it's Dafke the Aderes referring to the Vilna Gaon. And therefore he says, Vibal, the holy Vilna Gaon said what he said, we have to be magia the Shas. Givaldik. And he says the pasuk quoted in the Shas and Masechta Rosh Hashanah is the correct text should be, not the pasuk quoted from Parshas Vayeschanan, it has to be the pasuk quoted from Parshas Re'eh. Interessant, nein? Gorshay. And I thought if you take out the Rambam in front of you, you will see that the Rambam brings this Psak Halacha, right? If you have the sheet in front of you, and the Rambam quotes which pasuk? The Rambam also quotes the pasuk Lo Yisifu from Parshas where? From Parshas Vayeschanan. So according to the Aderes, he doesn't quote this Rambam. According to the Aderes, you're going to have to be Magia Masechta Rosh Hashanah, right? And according to the Aderes, you're going to have to be Magia the Rambam, right? And then according to the Aderes, you're going to have to also be Magia. This Lashon Rambam is quoted, by the way, also in the Orchis Chaim in Hilchas Nesias Kapayim, and also in the Kolboy in Siman Kuf Chof Hey in Hilchas Nesias Kapayim, and they all quote verbatim the Lashon Rambam. So you're going to have to be Magia in all these places that where it says Lo Yisifu, it means Lo Yisif. Where generally we have a rule, we don't do that. But nevertheless, let's give him the benefit of the doubt, and we'll be Magia it. Yeah, because there's no choice. We have to, if the Vilna Gaon said it, he said it. Interestingly, the Rav Shlomo Vilna in the Tshuva he mentioned earlier, even though he doesn't quote the Aderes Eliyahu, he also learns the Psukim like the Vilna Gaon, and he also he himself asks the question on himself. It seems that the Gemara on Rosh Hashanah who quotes the Pasuk of Parshas Vayeschanan doesn't follow with me, and he says, we can also be just corrected. Don't forget he came from Vilna. So he says we can correct the text, and it's not a problem. And then another pshat, he says, maybe the Gemara was the Medayik, in which Pasuk it brings, he meant mainly the gist and the message. I just want to say one thing. I personally didn't see such a Gvald and the Kasha of the Vilna Gaon. And that is because we find frequently that the Vilna Gaon's pshat is based, he says it in the Aderes Eliyahu and Parshas Re'eh, and it's based on the Sifri. In the Sifri, it's very clear that in Parshas Re'eh, the Sifri explains the specific mitzvahs and the details within each specific mitzvah. The Mela, based on that, the Vilna Gaon says, based on the Sifri, according to the Sifri, the Pasuk in Parshas Vayeschanan will be speaking about the general number of mitzvahs. That's the way I understood the Vilna Gaon and the Aderes Eliyahu. But Vaysechois, the Cheshbon Shel Mitzvah, the Aderes learned and understands this Vilna Gaon, that it has to coincide with all the texts wherever this din is found. And it could be Taka, that is Taka, the sheet of the Vilna Gaon in general, as we've seen. The Vilna Gaon wants that wherever the din is mentioned, it makes no difference in what sefer, it could be a Sifri and a Shas, but he emekt, he's Moichik, or he's Magia, that all the Svarim should be uniform. So even though Taka Elachanami, the Vilna Gaon says it dafka in the Sifri, the Mela personally, it wouldn't bother me if the Shas doesn't dafka follow with it. Nevertheless, l'shita sagra ba'atzmoi, the Cheshbon Shel Mitzvah definitely knows the shita sagra, and therefore says, I'm a daf mekken, u'magia zayin the Shas bavli. We're moving on, and that is, so even though that is their shita, let me share with you that there is a total opposite shita which dafka coincides with the psukim, and that is the shita of the Maharatz Chais. The Maharatz Chais in his Sefer Teres HaNeviim in the Chelik on Bal Toisif in Siman Gimel. So there he also has this approach that he explains the reason why the Torah has to mention two psukim, and he dafka explains Moshe Kapoyer. He doesn't bring no Vilna Gaon, and he explains just the opposite. He explains that the parsha in Pasuk in Parshas Vayeschanan, there it is written B'loshen Rabim. Take out, it says Lo Yisifu v'lo Yisigru. So there HaKadosh Baruch Hu is talking to each individual Yid. And each individual Yid, if he'll want to, so to speak, transform the specific mitzvah. And where it sits is with different amount of fringes. Etc., etc. So there, we tell him, that's why it says, we took the Klal Yisrael, when it comes to Parshas, when it comes to Parshas Re'eh, where there it says, B'loshen Yochid, he says, we're talking to the Bezdin, who he gives out a psak halacha. Who are we afraid that maybe they're going to add new chagim and moyadim or new mitzvahs? Who has the authority to do that? Dafka Bezdin, Dafka Meir Hira, Dafka Rav. It's not in the hands of the individuals. That's why it says over there, B'loshen Yochid, because they were talking about the general amount of mitzvahs, the general number of mitzvahs, or the general chagim and moyadim. And there the Torah says we address it to the Bezdin, which is one body, so to speak. That's why it's B'loshen Yochid. This is what the Maharatz Chais says. The Ma'aseh bePaulos and befurish Chazdei David and the Tosefta in Tosefta de Korbonos in Perik Hey Halacha Yud, and there the Chazdei David says He brings this Rambam and he bases it on the Rambam. He says, look, I see the Rambam. He also learns that there are two categories of mitzvahs, says two categories in Bal Toisif. And he says, definitely the first pasuk, Bibal, I see the Rambam quotes the Gemara on Rosh Hashanah. He quotes the pasuk, Lo Yisif, that's talking about the specific mitzvahs as mentioned, not like the Vilna Gaon, like the Meretz Chayes. Bal Derech Zeh, the second pasuk, Mashiach, and the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh is speaking about the general number of mitzvahs. The Rebbe in Likutei Sichos volume, the Lubavitcher Rebbe Schusay Yogan Aleinu in Likutei Sichos volume 14, and in volume 15, in the gloss, in the Ha'ora, brings to our attention. He actually asks, and takes issue with the Psikta Zutras and the Vilna Gaon. And he says that from the Rambam it comes out meferish, not so. He asks it from the Rambam, different Rambams, and that is the Rambam where the Rambam speaks. The Rebbe quotes many Rambams. There is a Rambam. I'm going to add a Rambam. And the Rambam in the beginning of Sefer Hayad, after he enumerates all the mitzvahs and he speaks about the mitzvahs the Rabbanon, right before he starts the Sefer Mishnah Torah. And then the Rebbe goes on to quote a Rambam in Perik Tes from Hilchas Yisedi HaTorah. Then he goes on to quote a Rambam in Hilchas Mamre in Perik Beis. Then he goes on to quote the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs and Mitzvah Shin Yud Gimel and Mitzvah Shin Yud Dalet. So there, where the Rambam speaks about the general number of Taryag mitzvahs, there the Rambam quotes Dafka, which pasuk? He quotes Dafka, the pasuk, not like the Vilna Gaon. You get it? He quotes Dafka, the pasuk, not like the Vilna Gaon. And the Rebbe says from the Rambam it comes out that Dafka, the second pasuk, the Rambam quotes Dafka, the pasuk Lo Yisif, not the Lo Yisifu. So it seems from the Rambam that the Rambam Taka doesn't learn like the Psikta Zutras and the Vilna Gaon. And as we just brought from the Chasdei David, that we see from Birchas Kohanim, Birchas Kohanim, from Birchas Tefillah, that when it comes to the specific mitzvah, he quotes Dafka, the pasuk of Parshas Vayeschanan. He'll then also references a Ramban in Parshas Vayeschanan, the Rebbe in the gloss, where the Parshas Vayeschanan refers also, the Ramban quotes that the pasuk, if someone wants to add a new mitzvah, says the Ramban, that is derived after from the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh. So it seems that the Ramban's personal opinion is not like the Psikta Zutras, and like, so Lamaisa it seems to be a Machlokes HaRishonim and a Machlokes HaMeforshim. Elamai Nafkeminis, there will be many Nafkeminis. Now is not the time to discuss the Nafkeminis. What is interesting and is really fascinating, if you take a look at your Rashi in front of your face, please be so kind, take a look at your Rashi. I'm sure your standard Chumash, if you don't have any Chumash you have, right? The regular Torah's Moshe. So when you take out your Chumash, you will see something fascinating in the Chumash. Rashi in Parshas Vayeschanan says, Lo Yisifu, says Rashi. Gaon, says Rashi, Gaon, Chomesh Parsha is between Chameshes Minim Belulav and Chomesh Tzitzias, V'chein B'lo Sigru. So he speaks about the specific details of the mitzvah, and he mentions Tefillin, Lulav, and Tzitzis. When it comes to Parshas Re'eh, Rashi says Rashi, take a look at the Rashi, and Lo Yisef Alav says Rashi, Chamisha Toitofes Betfilin, Hein Minim Belulav, and Arba Brochos Birchas Kohanim. So you see, number one, Rashi learns different than all these Meforshim. Rashi ala Torah, and he teaches both psukim are referring to specific mitzvahs, not to the general number of mitzvahs. That's number one. And then we find differences in the Lashon of Rashi. And that is, in the Rashi and Vayeschanan, Rashi says, when he talks about Tefillin, he says, Chomesh Parshia is betfillin. And when he says in Parshas Re'eh, he says, Chamisha Toitofo is betfillin. And in Parshas Re'eh, he doesn't mention the four brachas of Birchas Kohanim, and Dafka, he adds that in Parshas Re'eh. Actually, these Rashis are mentioned in the Cheshbon Shel Mitzvah by the Aderes. He doesn't go out to analyze it and explain the differences. But Dafka, the Rebbe in Likutei Sichos in volume 9, in the Parshas Vayeschanan, we take a look at the Sicha in the gloss. He goes in to explain all the specific details why Rashi seems to change the Lashonis. Actually, in the Sefer Maskele David, it quoted in the Pirush Bris Moshe on the Samag in the Lav in Simin Shin Samach Dalet, Lav in Shin Samach Dalet. So there he raises an issue. The Bris Moshe on the Samag is Robin Kleinvardein, I think. And Abe Weisberger once told me that that's I forgot, he's related or he's from Kleinvardein. Anyway, he'll fix it up for us. But anyway, I just remember he mentioned to me something about the Bris Moshe. So the Bris Moshe in the Lav in Shin Samach Dalet, he mentions, and he asks that he find all the Monei HaMitzvahs. He mentions many Monei HaMitzvahs, those who count out the mitzvahs, Dafka count the Lav of Bal Toisif. They quoted Dafka from Parshas Re'eh and not from Parshas Vayeschanan. And he claims that the reason why, the Bris Moshe says the reason why we count the Dafka from Parshas Re'eh is because Dafka and Parshas Re'eh, we know of the din that you're not allowed to add a fourth bracha to Birchas Kohanim, and because these Rishonim want to mention this lav, therefore they Dafka quote the din of Parshas Re'eh, and actually the Gur Aryeh. So he quotes the Sefer Maskil David, Rabbi David Pardo, but Lamaisa the Rabbi Gur Aryeh, the Maral Miprag also explains why Rashi Dafka adds this the Birchas Kohanim Dafka in Parshas Re'eh, and actually it's mefurish in the Sifri that we can know Dafka from Parshas Re'eh, as we'll go on to discuss. I'll call upon him. The Klei Chemda also goes into detail, goes to town in Parshas Vayeschanan on this Rashi, Ba'aruch and the flaw and the details of the differences of Rashi. So Rashi is mamash a third opinion. We're moving on. Let's go now to the sugya we want to discuss. Let's take out our Rambam. Please be so kind to take out your Rambam. And the Rambam says, well, actually, before we go to the Rambam is good. Have your Rambam in front of you, and I'll take out my Rambam also. And that is, we're reading the Rambam. We'll read the Rambam together, and that is, the Rambam says, Ein HaKohanim, halacha yud beis, Ein HaKohanim rashoyim b'chol mokem lohis b'roch al shlosh psukim. It's prohibited. The Kohanim aren't allowed to add. The Kohanim aren't allowed to add, aren't permitted to add other brachas on the three psukim. And he gives you an example. Again, for instance, the pasuk Hashem Elokei Avisechem Yosef Aleichem Kachem Elef Pa'omim. We find that in Chumash in Kapitel. Where is that? In Kapitel, I'll tell you right away what that pasuk is. That is, it's in your English section. You'll find it. It is in, where is it? Oh no, where is it? It's in Chumash Dvorim, Deuteronomy 11:11. So take a look at your left in your translation in your English. Okay, it's there. That's the bracha Moshe Rabbeinu blesses the Eden. So that's the example given. Ukayotze and the like. Loy b'kol ram v'loy b'lachash. Shanamar, we're going to just highlight first the Gaon. Shanamar, it says Lo Yisesifu ala davar, and he quotes the pasuk Lo Yisesifu, which is from the Parshas Vayeschanan as mentioned. Now let's go on. The Rambam says Gaon. Let me read for you the Gemara. And this is as follows. And this is just going to lead up to our issue, which we're going to discuss tonight. Basically, it's cut and paste from the Gemara. The Gemara says, how do we know that a Kohen is only l'duch, and that says Masechta Rosh Hashanah daf chav ches amud beis. This Gemara is recorded, as mentioned, we see it clearly in the Rambam. It's also brought in Rabbi Yitzchak al-Fasi in the Rif, the Sefer Masechta Megillah, because there it records all the halachas of Birchas Kohanim and the Siyas Kapayim from Masechta Soita, and also this Gemara he brings there too. And this is, like I said, also found in other Rishonim in the Moni HaMitzvahs. Even though it's not found, I didn't see it in the Samag, I didn't either see it in Sefer HaChinuch. So the Gemara says, how do you know that he can't add a third bracha? And the Gemara says, if he says he's keep going, he says, the Kohen is prohibited to be add another bracha. Keep going. For instance, Hashem Elokei Vayisechem Yosef Aleichem Kachem, Talmud Loim Alei Seisif Ala Dova. Full stop. Okay, so we're going to focus just on that. So let me just share with you, and this is going to lead us into a discussion which is relevant, which is the main discussion of tonight, and that is in a moment. Let me just bring to your attention a key principle, which is based on a Toisif and Masechta Sukkah. This is as follows. Bal Toisif, right? If we're taking another min of the lulav. Torah says we have to have 4 minim, the 4 types, right? We have to have a lulav and a hodos and an arava and an esrik. These are 4 minim. Does the Torah say we have to have the number 4? This is a very interesting, fascinating discussion, which now is not the time, but I just want to bring to your attention that there are certain mitzvahs where the number is inevitable, but the Torah didn't address the number. The Torah addresses the type. It just happens to be that because there are 4 types, there are 4 species. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says take the lulav and the esring and the hahodas and the arava. Does the Torah say you should take 4? It doesn't say in the Torah you should take 4. Torah says you should take these minim. These minim are 4. So the question is, what's the geder of Bal Toisif in such a case? So the Rogatchover has fascinating information on this, because he says there are certain mitzvahs where the Torah actually talks about the etzem mitzvah. And the etzem mitzvah is inevitable. It ends up being 4. When the Torah tells us to take parshios of the tefillin, does the Torah say take 4 parshios? No. Torah says you should take the parshios where the mitzvahs of tefillin is written. So it happens to be there 4. But the Torah didn't say 4. But then you have other mitzvahs where the Torah says the number. So the question is, like Lamites, Sometimes lamites malchus or whatever, certain things, there's a number. So there's number. Sometimes it enumerates the number. Sometimes it just tells you the mitzvah. From that, we know the number. So the Rogatchover has a lengthy analysis exactly what the Gather of Bal Toisif is there. And he Dafka has an interesting discussion and fascinating in Yonim. In this union of Bal Toisif in relation to the 4 brachas of Kohanim. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu never said you have to make 3 brachas. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says you should say Yevorechecha, Hashem yishmenecha, Yer Hashem ponu ve'elecha v'chuneka, Yis Hashem ponu ve'elecha v'yasim lecha shalom. It ends up being 3 brachas. So therefore we understand you can't add a 4th bracha. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu said 3 brachas. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said 3 psukim. Psukim, these psukim are 3. He never said 3. He said these psukim. So the shaila is what the Gather of Bal Toisif is in relation to the 4th pasuk. Let's move in the meantime. So let's go directly to Lulav. Okay, because Lulav there's a clear Toisvis. So Toisvis is mechadish. Toisvis teaches us. And this is brought to our attention by the Avnei Nezer and Erechaim Chelik Beisim and Tov Samach Zayin, and by the Lubavitch in this context of Bal Toisif, of the halachas of Bal Toisif. Realize that there's so many, it's a lengthy and in-depth discussion. Bal Toisif has many details and many halachas and many criteria, etc. We're only speaking about one specific inyan, and it can shed light to some degree on many other inyanim, but it's kol ha-Torah, there's loads of information. We're focusing mamash on one specific point as we'll go on. And that is, let's move. Excuse me. You know, I forgot to say l'chaim. Yidden dav zon l'chaim. Senoch yontif, the Yemei Tashlumin. We still find ourselves in the Yemei Tashlumin of Shavuos. So therefore, even though there's no Tashlumin for Simcha, like the Minchas Chinuch says, based on the Torah Yevon, so there's no Tashlumin for Simcha, but definitely, nevertheless, as long as we don't say Tachnun, so there is a certain sense of Simcha, like brought from the Butchacher, in Eshel Avram, in this that we don't say Tachnun, it's not just Zechel Amigdash like the Adara says. It's Taka an Inyan. And the Rogatchover Paskins befurish that the Yemei Tashlumin are Yemei Simcha like Yom Tov. We once discussed this, so whoever thought that we're going to say a shir, which we said so many times on Yemei Tashlumin from the Rogatchover Gaon, we Dafka didn't. So look at that. You see? So I misled you. I'm sorry. And I'm sure all of you out there who heard the shir so many times will Baruch Hashem be able to repeat it yourself. So the Rogatchover says, no, it's Ke'en Yom Tov. The Yemei Tashlumin are Ke'en Yom Tov. Baruch Atah Doinoi Eloheinu melech haolam she'akohen liyeh b'dvoroi. L'chaim. And join me. So I don't know if you fellows had an opportunity to have a Kiddush and Shul and join together. But G'doyle legime shemekareves is alle Yidden zusammen sollen Tage wünschen einen dem Zweiten, soll Tage sagen L'chaim und Levroche, als der Eibischer soll uns alle hitten, bis Klal Yisrael L'chaim. Okay. So the Avnei Nezer tells us this in Erechaim Tov Samach Zayin, and then also the Rebbe in his Rishimis, in his private personal notes, which were found only after Gimel Tammuz, and they were then published, were Zeicha to have the Rebbe's Chidush Torah, which he never ever said. I think it's close to 100 handwritten tiny words, tiny letters, like Rashi letters, close to 100 pages, and there were 5 svarim published from the Rebbe's Chidush Torah. So in his Rishimis, in the Rishima number Chaveres Nun, hey, I think it is, or Nun Ches, I can't see exactly what it is. It's Nun Ches, Chaveres Nun Ches. In that publication that came out as Contrasim at the time, and also mentioned in the Sefer Nefesh HaRav from Rav Shechter, the student of Rav Soloveitchik, Olav HaSholem. So, this is a known principle, and it's brought like all over. Toisvis tells us as follows. Toisvis says that in order to be over Bal Toisif, the additional mitzvah, the additional type, he talks about the 4 meaning. And Toisvis tells us, Ladas Rabbona, the Chachamim hold that Lulav, the Gemara says in the Masechta Sukkot Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, Lulav ain't Tzorich Eged. The Lulav doesn't have to be tied with the other meaning. Okay? According to them, you take him without tying them. If we tie them, it's only mitzvah benamuf chorzekel, livan veyu, as the Gemara says according to the Rabbon. But it's not actually part of the tying is not the essential part of the mitzvah like it is according to Rabbi Yehuda. Lulav ain't Tzorich Eged. Tosfos says, it's very clear from the Gemara that according to Chachamim, even if you tie the lulav with a different min, even if it's not, we tie our lulav, that's the minig generally, right? And we tie the lulav with the leaves of the lulav. But the Gemara makes it clear that even Ladas Rabbona, that you don't have to tie it. If you tie the lulav with the other meaning, with a different meaning, with a different species, with a different type of type, not one of the four minim, you are not over Bal Toisif. That's what it comes out from the Gemara. You added another min. There's another min there. There's another type. Hashem says, take four minim. The hodas, the lulav, the esrog, and the arava. You tie the lulav with another type, with another species, another type. So you should, why aren't you over Bal Toisif? Asks Toisvis. Basically, Toisvis explains as follows, that when are you over Bal Toisif? Only when what is added is performed like the initial mitzvah. In other words, and in this case, in the case of the lulav, the initial mitzvah, the din is you have to take derech giduloi. You can't take the lulav kapar up, right? That's why, you know, when you make the bracha on the esrog, for those who fear zich, who have the meaning, there are many ways the Rishonim explain that you should make the bracha before you take the lulav, the esrog in your hand, but nevertheless, a lot of Yidden fear zich that they turn the esrog over, right? Why do you turn the esrog over and then you turn it back? Because you have to make the bracha before you fulfill the mitzvah. And therefore, you turn it over, the pitim is kapar up, right? And the uketz is on the top. You make your bracha, and you make the bracha before you perform the mitzvah, you turn it back straight, because then it's derech gidula. In other words, you weren't mekayim the mitzvah if the esrog is kapar up, if the lulav is kapar up, etc., etc. We know all of that. It's obvious. And the same goes for the hodas and the arava. The Mela says Toisvis vibal the halacha is that the kiyum mitzvah of lulav of the dalet minim is only when it is derech giduloi. So for the added species, which you want to claim you should be over Bal Toisif, you are only over Bal Toisif if you do it in the same form and fashion like the initial mitzvah. And what are we talking about? True, you took a fifth min, right? The fifth type, so that should be Bal Toisif. Hashem says take four types. But the fifth type is not derech gidula. It's around, you're wrapping it around the minim. It's not upright. So Bibal, the fifth min, is being wrapped around and it's not upright, so it's not identical to the first four. Says Toisvis, therefore there's no Bal Toisif. That's what Toisvis says in that respect. Based on this Toisvis, the Avnei Nezer in Siman Tov Samach Zayin tells us that this is a general principle in Bal Toisif. It's not just a specific case for the lulav, it's a general case for all Bal Toisif. And therefore his father turns to him and asks him the shaila, why when a Yid sits in a sukkah when it's raining, the Shulchan Aruch only says that he's a hedyet, even though we used to say, Besser sein a hedyet vi agonit. Okay, excuse me for that, for those who got it, appreciate it. Besser sein a hedyet vi agonit, in the mele sitz und sei a hedyet. Because if you'll walk out, it's the Zayin Agonit. But Lamaisi Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah brings from the Yerushalmi, that if you sit in the sukkah when it rains, you're called a hedyet, right? A simple thing. You're not, even though you look like you want to be a Mahadar b'mitzvahs. Okay, so his father asks, the Avnei Nezer's father asks him, the Chazay Nochem, Babavustar Gaon, he asks him, why shouldn't there be a Bal Toisif where you're sitting? Why do we say he's only a hedyet? You're sitting, the halacha exempts you, right? And you sitting in the sukkah when it rains. So why aren't you over Bal Toisif? Why is it only a hedyet? And the Avnei Nezer says, because midin Torah, the sukkah is meant to be for your hana. So that's the gather of the mitzvah min Torah. You want to say that this, by he's sitting in the rain, it's a Bal Toisif, but then your sukkah in the rain, where the way you're performing it is not like the initial mitzvah. The initial mitzvah is not in a mode of mitzvah. It has to be in a mode of hana. So therefore, your Bal Toisif can only be when you're in a mode of hana. And because you're a mitzvah, because it's raining, so it's not like the initial mitzvah, so therefore it's like the case of the Toisvis, and therefore you're not over Bal Toisif. This is what it says in the Avnei Nezer, and he brings other examples. Okay. Ba'al derech zeh, let's go on. The Rebbe is asked by this individual, his name is Yisrael Ullman. The Rebbe penned this in 1933 in Riga, and that is Riga. Yeah, he penned this, and this Rabbi Yisrael Ullman, whoever he is, or it's a Yisrael Ullman, and this Yid asks the Rebbe Pshat in the Gemara. What does the Gemara say that when the Kohen is interested in adding a bracha, he gives you an example? Gaon, for instance, the bracha Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael. Why is there a need for an example? Number one, Gaon, and also why is there a need? And why is Dafka this bracha chosen out of all brachas? There's so many different psukim in the Torah. We mentioned different brachas. I mentioned that we choose Dafka, the bracha which is found Dafka in Chumash Dvorim, Why? There's so many brachas mentioned before. And that is, we find different brachas found in Parshas Toldos, in Parshas Vayechi, in Parshas Balak. Nevertheless, we dafka chose this. And the Rebbe explains, based on this principle, based on this Toisvis, that the addition has to be identical to the mitzvah in order to be regarded as you're transgressing, you're being over Bal Toisif. So take a look at your Rambam and you'll see as follows. In the Rambam above, right, in the copy, you will see it says, there's a halacha, it says, Koisev Vorchu, right before the halacha Yud Beis, the last line. So we derive from what it says in the Torah, Koisev Vorchu, so you should make the bracha. It says, B'Shem HaMefurish. You should make the Birchas Kohanim with the Shem HaMefurish, with the explicit name. V'hu sheyeh b'migdosh. And how is it explicit? With the Rambam, the Rashi says it Mefurish in Masechta Soita Daf Lamed Ches, that the Shem HaMefurish, we're talking here, even though in many other cases the Shem HaMefurish may be referring to the Shem Mem Beis, but in this case the Shem HaMefurish is referring to the Shem Yud Kei Vav Kei. So in the Beis HaMikdash, they expressed, the way they expressed the Yud Kei Vav Kei was the way it is actually written. So they said it explicitly. So that's the way it has to be done in the Beis HaMikdash. K'moshe Amarnu, the Rambam says, like the Gemara says and the Mishnah says, but in the big Gvulin, out of the Beis HaMikdash, you have to say the Yud Kei Vav Kei, but you say it Bikinui. Bikinuyov. What does Bikinui mean? You say it like Adonai, like we say always, Yud Kei Vav Kei. How do we say it? We don't say it the way it's meant to be pronounced. We say it right in a deviated way, in the way as if it was written Aleph Daled Nun Yud. That's the meaning. But definitely you need the Yud Kei Vav Kei L'chol HaDeis. Actually, there's an interesting Toisvis. The Toisvis, a gewaltige Toisvis. Toisvis in Masechta Soita brings a Pirush of Rabbeinu Hillel. When the Gemara says, O Eine Ele Bikinuyov, says Rabbeinu Hillel, you know what? In his Pirush on the Sifri, what does Bikinuyov mean? Keil, Elokim, etc. Keil, Elokim, all the different names of Hashem, that's the Kinuyov. Right? Asks Toisvis. We're talking about the Apostle, Yivarachach Hashem v'yishmerecha. Yor Hashem ponu ve'elecha v'chuneka. Yisa Hashem ponu ve'elecha. Where's there an Elokim and a Keil? How can you say Yivarachach Hashem? You should say Yivarachach Elokim. He can say Nazasal Kedaitach. So Toisvis says, Pshat in Kinuyov means like Rashi says and like the Rambam says. Kinuyov means you don't say the Yud Kei Vav Kei explicitly, you say it like as if it's written Aleph Daled Nun Yud. Okay, but I'll tell upon him, it's very clear that the Koisev Vorchu means you have to say the Yud Kei Vav Kei. Here comes the Rebbe, and the Rebbe explains, based on this principle of the Toisvis, that's the reason why the Gemara has to give an example, and that's the reason why we choose Dafka this example. And that is, Gemara says the example keep going. He's telling you when are you over Bal Toisif? The Kohen is over Bal Toisif Dafka. If he adds the bracha, which bracha? The bracha which says Hashem Elokei Avosechem Yosef Alechem Kochem Elef Panim, meaning it starts off with the Yud Kei Vav Kei. When is the Kohen over Bal Toisif? Only if he adds a fourth bracha which has the Shem HaMefurish, which has the Yud Kei Vav Kei. Meaning the Gemara is teaching us. Keep going. Dafka then Bal Toisif, because then it's identical to the initial mitzvah. Because if it was another bracha which doesn't have the Yud Kei Vav Kei, then you're not over Bal Toisif, because then it's lacking the gather of Bal Toisif. Bal Toisif demands that it should be like the mitzvah, like Toisif says, in relation to the fifth min of the lulav. Okay. And according to that, the Rebbe explains we can appreciate why the Rambam, take out your Rambam. If you're acquainted with the Rambam, very infrequent. The Rambam doesn't write Hilchas B'Taim, it doesn't give any reasons, and doesn't bring any examples, etc., etc. Dafka here, the Rambam quotes the Gemara verbatim, and he says, Kigoin. What do you have to bring the Kigoin? The Rambam should have just passed in the halacha the way it is without the Kigoin. Why does he give you the example? Says the Rebbe, no, because the Rambam is not just giving you an example, the Rambam is telling you a halacha. Everything the Rambam says is a halacha. This is a psak. The Rambam's telling us, it has to be dafka such a type of bracha which has the Shem HaMefurish, and any other bracha which has the Shem HaMefurish. But therefore, the Rebbe explains for this Yid, that's why, even though we'll find in Parshas Toldos, and in Parshas Vayechi, and in Parshas Balak, in other words, many different places in the Chumash where we find brachas in the Torah before the pasuk of Yosef Hashem Elokei Avosechem Yosef Alechem Kolchem, we don't mention them. Why we don't mention them? Because over there's no Yud Kei Vav Kei. So there's no bracha found in the Chumash until the pasuk in Dvorim, in Dvorim 11, which should say benusach yud kei vavkei, and that's why the Gemara brings dafke the kegoin, and that's why the Rambam records it lahalacha. The Rebbe therefore concludes, nevertheless, we don't find the Shulchan Aruch should bring this kegoin, which is l'chera taka interesting according to the Rebbe's pshat. This is a yisod in halacha, but it has to be dafke this gather. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't bring it, and nor does the Torah bring it, nor does the Shulchan Aruch brings it, and also the Rav Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, even though he brings many details, it doesn't bring it. Doesn't bring the kegoin. Dafka levush brings the kegoin. The levush brings the kegoin. But nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe, even though it generally goes in the shittas levush, doesn't quote this levush. This kegoin, as he follows usually with the Rambam, doesn't bring the kegoin. The Rebbe says, of course, possibly as follows. The Rebbe is mechadish that the Bal Toisif, the lav of the Torah, is dafka when it's identical. But there may still be an issur. There may still be a prohibition, even if it's not identical. Okay? So, that's the reason why the Shulchan Aruch omitted the kegoin. But we're going back to the Rambam. I'll call upon him, following in this vein, following in this sheet of the Rambam, that definitely the Rambam appreciates and follows with this Yesod and Bal Toisif, and this is also Mefurish Rogatchover, where the Rogatchover discusses the ongoing statement of the Rambam. The Rogatchover also references this Toisvis. The Rogatchover knows all the Rambams, and the Rogatchover also references this Toisvis to explain a Rambam. So in other words, the Rambam will also accept this principle in the Gdorim of Bal Toisif. If so, here we go. The Rambam, let's go on, and the Rambam says, for instance, the Rambam says, he can't add a bracha on the 3 psukim, and he says, for instance, this pasuk as mentioned. Then he says, "Loi b'koil ram v'loi b'lachash," not in a loud voice and not silently, right? Not out loud and not silently. As I state in Rambam, okay. Now, the Shas doesn't say "Loi b'koil ram v'loi b'lachash." The Shas doesn't mention it. The Sifri, even though the Sifri also, like we mentioned, the Parshas Rei brings this Gemara, right? It says this halacha. Nevertheless, it doesn't say Loi b'koil ram v'loi b'lachash. The Rambam goes out of his way and mentions a definition in this din. Now, when he adds a 4th pasuk, he is oiver b'Bal Toisif, Loi, even if he says it either with a loud voice, or if he says it even in silently whispering or silently, he doesn't say it loud. Ver the shaila, and this is l'chayra navi shaila. The Rambam, take a look at the halacha right before. Take a look at the line right before the Kaisav Baruch Hu B'Shem HaMefurish. The Rambam says, it says in the pasuk, Kaisav Baruch Hu B'Koil Ram. You have to make the Birchas Kohanim B'Koil Ram, right? Take a look at all the dinim. Kaisav Baruch Hu B'Amida, the Kohanim have to stand. Kaisav Baruch Hu B'Nesiyas Kapayim, they have to do it with, they have to have their palms stretched out. Kaisav Baruch Hu, they have to say it Lashon HaKodesh, Dafka in the holy tongue, Lashon HaKodesh. Kaisav Baruch Hu Panim Keneged Panim, you have to face the people have to face the Kohen face to face. Kaisav Baruch, you have to say it aloud with a loud voice. Kaisav Baruch Hu B'Shem HaMefurish. Now, based on what we just finished discussing, in Kaisav Baruch Hu B'Shem HaMefurish, the same should follow based on the Toisvis and the Masechta Sukkah. The same should follow when it comes to Koil Ram. Now, when is the fellow over B'Bal Toisif? If he's adding a 3rd bracha, if he does it with all the guidelines of what he mentioned before, only if he adds the 4th bracha, and he does it ba'amidah, and he does it b'nesiyas kapayim, and he does it b'lashon hakodesh, and he does it panim keneged panim, and he does it b'koil ram, and he does it b'shem ha'mefurish, then he's over b'Bal Toisif. Nevertheless, the Rambam says, when you're over b'Bal Toisif, he says, loy b'koil ram v'loy b'lachash. You're not allowed to do it even if it's silent. We're talking about Bal Toisif. And the mitzvah is performed only if it's b'koil ram. So what's the problem if you add a 4th bracha silently? Just like we explained, there's no problem. I'll go pun him in the Torah is Bal Toisif. To add it, if there's no Hashem HaMefurish, so why should there be a problem if you say it silently? The Kiyum mitzvah will be lacking if you don't say it. If you say it silently, you have to say it aloud. And many poskim the Mishnah Berurah brings, and many Rishonim and many Achronim Al Kolpon, and many poskim learn, and the ones who ask the Shaila say that all the dinim of the Rambam, which he enumerates, the different dinim he mentioned, are le'ikuva, are essential. All the ones who ask this Shaila of the Rambam, this is not my Shaila. This is a Shaila which the Rogatchover Gaon addresses, but it's found on many other Achronim. And that is, they mainly ask it in this mode and in this style. They claim, Vibal, all these dinim are essential. So it's the essential for the performance of the mitzvah, if essential for the performance of the mitzvah. So how can the Rambam say that if he's lacking the balachash, he is what? There will be a Bal Toisif. Obvious question, l'cha'ira. Okay, now, let me bring to your attention, this Shaila is brought to our attention by Rabbi Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, the colleague of the Rogatchover Gaon, in his Chidushei Rabbi Meir Simcha. In addition to generally, he's known that he wrote the Somech on the Rambam, and he wrote the Meshech Chochma, sorry. The Meshech Chochma on Chumash. Bal Toisif, in the last many years, in Tafshin Nun Dalid, almost like 35 years ago about, I believe, right, they published Chidushei Rabbi Meir Simcha Lashas. That was found from Ksav Yadin, which before his Ptira, he gave it away to the Rav in Riga, that he should publish it for him, and he published, and they found the Ksav Yad, and they published it. So there are a lot of Chidush Torah there on the Sechta Seita. In Daf Lamed Ches, the Rabbi Meir Simcha raises this issue, and I'll share it with you in a moment. This same Shailish is raised also by the Mishnah Berurah. By the Mishnah Berurah in the Bir Halacha in Siman Kuf Chav Ches, and it's also raised by the Aderes in a Shailas Teshuvos. He wrote a Shailas Teshuvos called Man Eliyahu, which was published in Eretz Yisrael from Ksav Yad. From the Hesder Yeshivas, they published it. I'll call upon him. In Siman Kuf Chav Beis, he raises this issue, and he brings to our attention that the Mishnah Berurah and the Bir Halacha raised the issue. What's the issue? The issue is as follows. The Rabbi Meir Simcha says, he asks the obvious Shaila. He says, when it comes to the Gemara, it's very clear from the Gemara that you have to say it b'koil ram. You have to say the Birchas Kohanim aloud, right? And but mainly he says as follows. If it has to be said aloud, especially if it is what? If it's essential, right? So therefore, it would make sense that if the Kohen who adds a bracha, and he says it silently, he won't be over Bal Toisif. Like we explained, he just takes it for granted. Doesn't explain himself, doesn't substantiate it. But we explained that it's substantiated based on the Toisvus, based on these are principles and general givens when it comes to the Gather of Bal Toisif. Actually, Rav Shechter adds, I think it's Rav Shechter, adds in the Nefesh Harav that it's also obvious from the Sechta Eruvin that these principles, these guidelines are like, so to speak, essential when it comes to Bal Toisif, not just based on the Toisvus. Okay. So he goes on to say, says the Rabbi Meir Simcha as follows. If he wouldn't say it b'koil ram, the Baldi Gemara says b'dirai that it has to be b'koil ram. If he wouldn't say it b'koil ram in a loud voice, you wouldn't be over Bal Toisif. He said the same would apply if the Kohen wouldn't do it b'nesiyas kapayim. Imagine if the Kohen, when he says the actual brachos, right? He adds a fourth bracha without raising up his kapayim, right? Would it be over Bal Toisif? Says Rabbi Meir Simcha, b'pashtus you won't be over Bal Toisif either. Because just like we know that all these dinim are essential, so if you're lacking what is essential, it's only a bracha in general, it's a good bracha. But it's not begeder Birchas Kohanim. It's not begeder nesiyas kapayim. And these are guidelines and essential principles, elements for what? To fulfill the mitzvah of nesiyas kapayim. So therefore, like we said, the additional bracha has to be identical. And he says, so it would seem the same would apply if you don't do it with nesiyas kapayim. The Mela asks Rabbi Meir Simcha, take out a Rambam. In the Rambam, it says that even if you say it b'lachash, you're over Bal Toisif. Asks Rabbi Meir Simcha, why should you be over Bal Toisif? Listen to his lashon. We need tzorachin, what the Rambam says, and we have to search where does the Rambam take this to say that there's a Bal Toisif, even b'lachash. In other words, the Rabbi Meir Simcha learns all the dinim are identical. If b'pashtus, if you need kol ram, if you do it b'lachash, there shouldn't be a Bal Toisif. The same should apply to the nesiyas kapayim. And then he says, what's puzzling and surprising is, and fascinating, he said the Shulchan Aruch and the other Mechabrim don't quote what the Rambam says. When the Shulchan Aruch records this din, that the Kohen is not allowed to add another bracha, you would have expected the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Beis Yosef, the Mechaber, genuinely sticks to the Lashon Rambam. He records this din, but he doesn't mention loy b'koil ram v'loy b'lachash. He omits that section. So Rabbi Meir Simcha only proves from here that you see, there's some problematic issue with it. Not in vain the Shulchan Aruch omitted it. That's what he wants to hint, so to speak. And therefore, we have to understand this Rambam. Where's the Rambam coming from? What's the pella? Where's it coming from? And he says, the Shulchan Aruch, who doesn't mention it, how like dover the zoktepes. Pella de gezach. Well, there is the Mishnah Berurah. Listen to the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah, I'm going to share with you the Bir Halacha. Whoever has a Mishnah Berurah can take out his Bir Halacha. That is in Simon Kuf Chav Ches. It's in this din. Sif Chav Zayin, in the Bir Halacha. So in the Bir Halacha, he explains on his own. He comes to say, look, it's the Kohen is over by Bal Toisif, and says the Bir Halacha, it's l'chayre, it would seem, he says, on his own, that if the Kohen says this fourth bracha without spreading out his hands, and the like, or if he's lacking any other of those guidelines which we mentioned, which we enumerated, right? It wouldn't be regarded as a hisafa on the mitzvah, right? Like we discussed till now. It would only be regarded as a plain bracha. And interestingly, he bases it on the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. V'chein kosav b'Shulchan Aruch hagraz ayin sham. So I'm going to fulfill a directive, mitzvah of the Mishnah Berurah. Imagine if the Mishnah Berurah would come to you, to Chofetz Chaim would say to you and tell you, go somewhere, do this. Wouldn't you go out of your mind and out of your way to fulfill a request of his? So Bibal the Bir Halacha says, ayin sham, look this, I'm going to look there, and I'm going to be mekayim a directive of the Chofetz Chaim, because the Chofetz Chaim is alive. And therefore, when I look there, the Alter Rebbe says as follows. In Sif Mem, he's not allowed to add on his own accord more than the 3 psukim of Birchas Kohanim, and if he adds it, he's over by Bal Toisif, and the Balatani, the Alter Rebbe, the Shulchan Aruch Harav adds, Im Omar b'nesias kapayim u'b'achzoras ponim klapi ha'om. If he says, when is he over by Bal Toisif? If he says it with his hands spread out, and if he faces the people face to face. What's the mocker of the Balatani of the Rav? Well, Rav Tanahu Upolig. The Alter Rebbe doesn't need a mocker. We know very well. And B'meila, what he says is good enough for us. But interestingly, he must have had a mocker. And Lamai said, there's a mocker. And what is the mocker? The Mishnah Berurah Dafke brings a Rashba in Masechta Sukkah. It's a Rashba in Masechta Sukkah. Lamai says it's a Rashba, which we know Lamai said today is a Ritva. So you'll take out a Chidushi or Ritva in Masechta Sukkah Daf Lamed Aleph. The same Ritva says the same thing in Masechta Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Chesed, the Sugya of Bal Toisif. Now he says, the Maaseh B'Pearl, the Ritva says it for different reasons, and therefore, I'm not going to go into it, but I'm just going to hint to you and bring to your attention that Harav Hutner, Olav Hasholem, Harav Yitzchok Hutner, and Pachad Yitzchok, in the Sefer HaZikaron, Pachad Yitzchok, says, I don't know what the Mishnah Berurah is asking, his whole kasha doesn't get off the ground, and he says, this, what it says in the Rashba, has nothing to do with what he wants to convey, and therefore he remains with the Tzorachim on the Mishnah Berurah, and he says this in context. He writes a letter, he has correspondence with Harav Rifkin, who was a Talmud in Toimchet Tmim in Lubavitch, and he was a Rav in the Chotzer of the Rebbe Rashab, and wrote a sefer called Teferes Tzion, and there he was a Rosh Yeshiva in Torah V'Das, and one of the Ziknei Chassidim who sat behind the Rebbe. Everybody knew of him, Rabbi Mordechai Dov Rifkin. And he in the Sefer talks about Bal Toisif, and he reconciles the kasha of the Mishnah Berurah, says Harav Hutner to him in a correspondence, I don't know why you have to reconcile it the way you're reconciling it. The whole kasha doesn't get off the ground, and the Rashba has nothing to do with this Mishnah Berurah, what he wants to convey. Please look there in the Sefer HaZikaron of Pachad Yitzchok. And we can't discuss not what the Pachad Yitzchok says and not what the Tiferes Tzion says, because they have a total different approach in the whole analysis and the need, why we need the Nesias Kapayim, and why we need the Koil Rum, and why we need the Hachzoras Ponim Klapi Ha'om. But going back to the approach of Rav Meir Simcha and the Aderes in the Mishnah Berurah, and the way it seems from the Rav Shulchan Aruch. He says there's only the Bal Toisif. We don't know, I'll be honest with you, even the way the Tiferes Tzion learns, or even the way mainly the way Rav Hutner learns, we can also learn in the Balatanya that way. So I don't want to use the Balatanya either as support for what the Mishnah Berurah is saying, but let's not go there. I'm very sorry that I'm speaking in riddles. It's too late. The Iker. But just taking the Rav at face value, that the Mishnah Berurah saw him. So the Rav Shulchan Aruch says, when is the Bal Toisif? Only when it's Nesias Kapayim, B'Bachzoros Pronim Klapei Ha'om, which the guidelines are, like we said, because it has to be identical to the initial mitzvah, right? Mashenke, the others learned that the reason is a different reason. In order, it shouldn't be Zele Chudikoi, Zele Chudikoi. If you'll figure out that's a Sugi in Sanhedrin. That's what the Ikar, what Rav Hutner wants to claim. But that's what it says in the Ritva. But let's say, because that's what the Rav Balatanya means, that the Rav means, it's not identical. And therefore, he goes on to say in the brackets, therefore, we say the Hashkifa, right? The Kohen says the Hashkifa, says the Alter Rebbe. Why does he say it? He says it only after he turns his face from the people. Now, why isn't Hashkifa regarded as an additional bracha? You know why? Because he's not a problem. Because he's lacking the essential upon him, keneged ponim. You get it? Because he's not saying it b'nesias kapayim. Because the Kohen has to say it after he turns his face away and after he puts his hands down. That's when he says Hashkifa. And the market for this Balatanya is a Rashi on the Rif in Seif Mesechta. This the Rebbe says in the Rishimas in his notes. The Mocker is a Rashi on the Rif in Seif Mesechta Megillah. Where there the Rashi on the Rif explains about the Yehi Rotzon, which the Kohen says before he starts the Duchenim. So why isn't that part of the brachas? He says the reason why it's not part of the bracha is because he turns his face away from the people. He hasn't yet turned his face to the people. So the Rebbe says for the same reason, at the end of the brachas, it's not a problem of Bal Toisif because the Alter Rebbe is saying, because he says the Hashkifa away from the people. But it's very clear, says the Mishnah Berurah from the Rav Shulchan Aruch, that you need to have the same guidelines of the initial mitzvah. Now, the approach of the Mishnah Berurah is that all these dinim are essential. The Balatanya's Shita seems to be that even if they're not essential, it also is problematic if it's not identical to the Kiyum Mitzvah of Birchas Kohanim, which that the Rebbe addresses in his Rishima. So I'm not going to go there now. So that's also another detail. But again, the general approach. So basically, the Mishnah Berurah claims that then he says, fine. So he says, look, it seems from the Rav Shulchan Aruch that all the dinim, which the Rambam enumerates, follow along, right? In other words, if one is lacking, so then there's no problem of Bal Toisif. So then he has a kasha on the Rambam. He says, look, I take out a Rambam. The Rambam seems to say that if you say Balachash, you are over Bal Toisif. There is a Bal Toisif. So then he makes, so the Mishnah Berurah says, it would seem from this Rambam that he says that if the voice is Balachash, there's a Bal Toisif, but it seems that everything else will follow. According to the Rambam, there'll be a Bal Toisif, even if it's not B'nesias Kapayim, even if it's not B'Shem HaMefurish, even if it doesn't have all the other essentials. In other words, he claims, he understands that the Ritva, this Rashba, and this Rambam are basically cup of cup. This portion, there's a machlokes harishonim according to the take of the Mishnah Berurah, that according to the Rashba, all the inyanim, every one of those, if one of them is lacking, you're not over Bal Toisif. According to the Rambam, if any one of them are lacking, not just the Lachash, you will be over Bal Toisif. And he concludes with Sorachiyun. It remains problematic and questionable. Now, let me just bring to your attention as follows quickly. We have to come to the Rogatchover because it's late. So as it is, it's overtime. But nevertheless, we bound this Yibiyat Tashlumin, so you'll give us an option to be Mashlim. Thank you. Now, let me share with you as follows. The fact is, this Shaila is also asked by a Rav Soloveitchik in the Sugi of Bal Toisif, not the Mishnah Berurah. He asked the Shaila on the Rambam. In other words, he doesn't quote, there's no Rameir Simcha there. He, in the Harav Soloveitchik, in the Rishimas Shiurim, in the Sechta Suk, in the Sugi of Bal Toisif, he also asks the Shaila on the Rambam, why the Rambam, where the Rambam took it from, and why Taka does the Rambam pass, and that even Balachas there's a Bal Toisif. There's a gloss there, a note, in the Rishimas Shiurim, and the note, according to the introduction to that sefer, it seems that the note, the reconciliation, is from a student, not from the Harav Soloveitchik himself, but like I say, those who want to look in the note there. This Shaila is also raised in the Nefesh Harav. In the Nefesh Harav, and also in the Likutei Torah and Parshas Nasa in the Sefer Nefesh Harav, and it's also analyzed and reconciled. Let's move on. Let me just bring to your attention an interesting reconciliation, which seems to clear the whole issue. And this is as follows. In the Sefer Meiser Rekeach is a Hasfardi. The known commentary on the Rambam is known as the Meiser Rekeach Hasfardi. And the Meiser Rekeach, when it comes to this Lashon of the Rambam, where the Rambam says, Loi b'kolon, v'loi b'lachash, says the Meiser Rekeach. Now this, by the way, the Meiser Rekeach is quoted by in the, no, it's not quoted. Let me tell you where it's quoted. There's a sefer called Eila HaMitzvahs. Eila HaMitzvahs is from a Yid, a Rav, and not far from Varsha. It says his name was Rabbi Chaim Meshulam Koifman HaKoyen. And this sefer, Dafka Eila HaMitzvahs, has a lengthy discussion. It was published in Petrikov in Tofrei Samach Vov in 1905. He was a Talmud of the Ostrovtzer. And there's a haskoma, there's a hamlotza, there's a approbation of the Rogatchover going in the Sefer, and the Rogatchover signs off the letter, Yedidi Minorai. He was the Rogatchover's friend, not from your Kindweis, Yedidi Minorai. So interesting, and Dafka in the Sefer, Eila HaMitzvahs is a big London, so there he quotes this Meiser Rekeach. Val derech zeh, Dafka in the Binyan Shleima, which we mentioned originally, he wants to say it on his own. But listen to what the Meiser Rekeach says. He quotes the Sifri in Parshas Re'eh. In Sifri in Parshas Re'eh, listen to what the Sifri says. How do I know Shem Posach levorich Birchas Kohanim shelo yoimar? A Kohen shouldn't say, Hoilo posachti levorich. I mean, he's allowed to say Hashem Elokei v'seichem beisav aleichem. Talmud loymar dovor. The pasuk says, "Kol hadovor asher anochi mitzav eschem." Dovor says the Sifri. You know what dovor means? Afilu dibur loisoisif alav. Afilu dibur. In other words, this is a special halacha. All the mitzvahs we know are b'maaseh. Here we have a special halacha of Birchas Kohanim. That's what the Mefarshim say, that as Dafka comes about, Dafka, we know of this Dafka in Parshas Re'eh. That's why Rashi, some Mefarshim say, adds this Dafka in Parshas Re'eh, because we know it from the Loshen, Kol HaDovar Asher Anochi Mitzav Eschem. In addition to what it says, Tishmeru Lasos, you have to keep it on that. The Torah says, don't add and don't subtract. Torah says, Kol HaDovar, which is Afilu Dibur. Even in relation to Dibur, Torah says, don't add and don't subtract. So from there we know that refers to what? To Dibur. The Mela says the Meiser Rekeach, Dibur. What does Dibur mean? Stam Reden. There's no koil wrong. What someone speaks. He could be speaking silently, balachach. He could be speaking aloud. So Bibald, it says afilu Dibur Stam, it would seem that any type and style and mode and fashion of Dibur. So he claims, the Meiser Rekeach claims that the mocker of this Rambam is Dafka from the Sifri. From the Sifri in Parshas Re'eh, afilu Dibur Stam, even if it's not B'Koil Rom, and it's a special halacha that even though it's not identical to the Kiyum Mitzvah of Birchas Kohanim, nevertheless is Exeres HaKosuf Kilu, that there is a Bal Toisif when it's B'Dibur afilu B'Lachash, which according to that, if you'll take that approach, the whole approach of the Mishnah Brura doesn't clap. In other words, this is an exception. In other words, when it comes to all the other halachas, of course, the Rambam will agree to the Ritva, to the Rashba in Mesech Sukkah that has to have all the guidelines of Birchas Kohanim. But Dafka, this is an exception. Koil Ram is an exception, and we can appreciate that because you notice the Rambam only says it in relation to the Koil. The Rambam chooses Dafka that example. Why does the Rambam choose Dafka that example? Vaisechuisi holds that Dafka only their approach. It applies. According to the Meiser Rekeach, that follows very well. According to the Mishnah Berurah with Bitzarachiyun, he claims that what the Rambam just brings it on as an example, right? But really it goes along and all the other mitzvahs follow along and all the other guidelines follow along. So why did the Rambam choose Dafka, that example? According to the Meiser Rekeach, it applies only in such a case. That's an easy way out, and interesting, like I said, the Binyan Shleima on his own, doesn't bring the Meiser Rekeach, wants to say that, maybe shot in the Rambam. It's an easy way out, and if you like it, take it. Because we got to move quickly now. Now, I would like to say as follows. I would like to say that the Rogatchover Gaon and Rav Meir Simcha argue cup of cup. Poshet HaMachloikes Moshe Kapoyer. In other words, Chveches Veres Kapoyer, excuse me, they're a Beit Grace Yidin. But they Dafka don't see eye to eye in this Inyan. And this comes about based on another shtickle of Rav Meir Simcha. And I believe because Rav Meir Simcha learned the way he learned, therefore, when it comes to this din of belachash, he identified, just like you have to say the Birchas Kohanim b'kol ram, the same, all the other guidelines apply. Like the Mishnah Berurah said. In other words, in that respect, the Rabbi Meir Simcha goes along with the Mishnah Berurah goes along with the Rabbi Meir Simcha, that if we say we need the guidelines of Birchas Kohanim, so just like the Rashba mentions Nesias Kapayim, and it doesn't mean Dafka, it means all the other guidelines, only then is there a Bal Toisif, the same the Rambam. If he holds that there's no Bal Toisif, there is a Bal Toisif, even without the Kol Ram, all the rest go along. Let me explain to you possibly why Rabbi Meir Simcha and the Mishnah Berurah learned that way. Mainly Rabbi Meir Simcha, not so much the Mishnah Berurah. And that is as follows. There's another shtickle of Rabbi Meir Simcha. And that is as follows. Toisvis in Masechta Sukkah. It's a simple thing. So just hang in with me. It's like not early, but nevertheless, we're wrapping it up. Toisvis, the Gemara says, how do we know that we have to say it b'koil ram in a loud voice, says the Gemara? Because it says, that's the Gemara in Saita. Let me bring to your attention the Gemara in Saita. Excuse me, let me just find the Gemara in Saita. Where's the Gemara in Saita? Tatas is Sabuda Gemara Saita. Komm es erst gehabt. Oh, Sinegit. Anyway, we know the Gemara says in Saita. How do we know that it has to be? Oh, here's the Gemara Saita. Ein minute, Zeit Moichel. I'll read for you the Lashon. In Daf Lamet Chesam Adalef, the Gemara says in Saita as follows. The Gemara says, Ein Rega. Zog the Gemara, Kaisavaраchu b'koil ram. Kaisavaраchu tells us like the Rambam says. Kaisavaраchu is b'koil ram. We saw it in the Rambam. Says the Gemara, maybe Kaisavaраchu means so, meaning Kaisavaраchu means so you should say the bracha. That's what the Kodesh Baruch Hu says to the Kohanim. Says the Gemara, the meaning of Kaisar Baruch is b'koil ram with a loud voice. Says the Gemara, maybe it means even silently, with an undertone, silently. Some say lachash means silently, some say lachash means whispering, but I'll tell Panim, it's not b'koil ram. Talmud Loimar, therefore the Torah says, Omer Lahem. What does Omer Lahem mean? Ka'adam sha'omer lechaver. Like a person speaks to his friend. When a person speaks to his friend, he doesn't whisper. When a person speaks to his friend, he doesn't say it with an undertone, silently. He speaks up, like we say. Speak up, right? So that's the b'koil ram. Asks Toisvis as follows. Ask Toisvis, why do we need to derive it from koi sevorach? Why can't we know it from a gzera shava of har grizim v'har evel? Now, it's questionable why Toisvis asks his question exactly what Toisvis says. Toisvis says, Tamalari. It's puzzled. The Re was puzzled. Why was the Re so puzzled? It's discussed in other Mefarshim. We're not going to go there. But Toisvis asks, because we find at the beginning of the Gemara, how do we know that it has to be said b'lashon HaKodesh? Says the Gemara, it says Kaisavaраchu. So, Kaisavaruchu, how do we know it has to be dafka done? The Birchas Kohanim has to be said in Lashon Kodesh. Says the Gemara, we derive it, Gzeira Shava, from where? From Har Grizim v'Har Evel. Just like Har Grizim and Har Evel had to be done by Lashon HaKodesh. It says, Elo Yamda Levarach Esa'on. Just like over there, the Gemara derives in Daf Lamed Beis and Daf Lamed Gimel. So by Har Grizim and Har Evel, when the Leviim are Mevarach Esa'on, right? The Shvatim stood in Har Grizim and Har Evel. So they said the bracha b'Lashon HaKodesh. Have to, it's b'Lashon HaKodesh. So over there it says Lashon bracha. Here it says Lashon bracha. Just like over there it's Lashon HaKodesh. Here too it's b'Lashon HaKodesh. The Gemara over there says, Rabbi Yehuda says, you don't have to come out to the Gezerah Shava. It says in the Torah, Koi Savarachu. Koi means the way it's written. The way it's written. Achiyem b'Lashon Hazeh. Azoi soll man sagen. Wie Azoi? Wie steht in Chumash? Wie steht es in Chumash? In Lashon Kodesh. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. I'll call upon him. The Gemara mentioned earlier, Gzeira Shava, right? If the Gemara already mentioned the Gzeira Shava earlier, why doesn't the Gemara use the same Gzeira Shava to tell us that it has to be b'koil ram? Why? Because if you say, in the Gemara says, how do you know it's b'koil ram? You know why? Because the din is that by the fact is that by the Levim, it says va'onu. That the Levim said the bracha is b'koil ram. It's in the Mefurish Pasuk in Parshas Kisavoy. Take out of Kisavoy, and it says that the Levim are saying it b'koil ram. And all the Yidden say Amen. After they say the order of the bracha, they say Amen. So they're saying it, this is Mefurish in the Torah B'Kol Ram. So let's use the Gzeira Shava. Now Tosfos concludes to say that may be the difference between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. Just like above, the Chachamim needed the Gzeira Shava. And the Rabbi Yehuda said we don't need the Gzeira Shava. So Tosfos says the same applies in this din of B'Kol Ram. The Gemara is saying it here. Of Kaisa Baruch, we know it, that goes according to Rabbi Yehuda, but that we know it from the Kol Ram of the Levim, that goes according to the Chachamim. That's what Tosfos says. Says Rabbi Meir Simcha as follows. Listen to what Rabbi Meir Simcha argues. He says as follows. He says the Kol Ram by the Levim, it says V'onu Chalam V'amru Amen. You know why you have to say it loudly there? You know why you have to say it aloud? Because the people have to hear. You say to them, Baruch, the blessed who will ever fulfill these and these things. We're enumerating different things they're being cursed for. We're enumerating different things they're being blessed for. So therefore we're giving guidelines to the Am Yisrael, what they should do and what they shouldn't do. Take out your Parsha Savai. So therefore they have to hear. If they're not going to hear, it's the Gaon Shov Giton. The Mela therefore, they have to hear. The Mela therefore depends on their hearing. So therefore it has to be said with a loud voice, Kol Ram, says Rabbi Meir Simcha. But our case is a total different case, says Rabbi Meir Simcha. Here the din of saying it b'Kol Ram is a din in the Tzuras Ha'amira. It's not relevant to the ones who hear it. It's not negated to the ones who hear it. You don't have to hear it to Dafka. The Mevarach has to say the bracha b'Kol Ram. In other words, I'm embellishing it a bit. Just like the Mevarach has to say it B'Lashon HaKodesh. Just like the Mevarach has to say it. These are guidelines in the Tzuras HaBrocha, right? Otherwise, it's not a Birchas Kohanim. He has to say it Ba'amidah. He has to say it B'Nesiyas Kapayim. He has to say it B'Lashon HaKodesh. He has to say it Panim Keneged Panim. He has to say it b'Kol Ram. If he's not saying it b'Kol Ram, it's not called Birchas Kohanim. It's a bracha, it's not Birchas Kohanim. But where does it say that they have to hear it? So by the Levim, there's a need that's essential for them to hear it. Well, it's essential for them to hear it. That's why it's b'Kol Ram. So the Kol Ram there is relevant to the recipient. The Kol Ram by the Birchas Kohanim is not relevant to the recipient. And he gives an example. Listen to the example given. The din is as follows, and that's a Psak Halacha in Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam. Listen carefully. Beis HaKnesset shekula Kohanim. You have a shul which only has Kohanim. The Gemara says, a ir shekula Kohanim, a city which only has Kohanim. Or a shul which only has Kohanim, right? And says the Gemara, what's the psak? We say they all go up for Birchas Kohanim. And who are they going to say the bracha to? So the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch says, and the Gemara says that the women and the children will answer Amen, right? And that is only bigvulin. But we can have a scenario where there's no women and no children, and that is in the Beis HaMikdash. In the Beis HaMikdash, you don't need three separate brachas. You don't answer Amen. It's all as one bracha. So therefore, there's no separation of Amen. So it can be even without women and children. Like the Mefarshim say, the women and children are needed only for the way the Birchas Kohanim is said out of the Beis HaMikdash. But in the Beis HaMikdash, it's all said one after the other without the Amens. So imagine, there's no one in the shul, Nebuch, like our shuls looked like to a degree in lockdown of the quarantine, and the shul was restricted, and you can only have 10 people. So just imagine, you need for Birchas Kohanim a minyan, right? Just imagine all of the people who registered for your minyan, the 10 people, are all Kohanim. Okay, listen carefully. And they're all going up to Duchen, and they're going to say the Birchas Kohanim. And there's no one else in shul, because they don't allow women or children in, right? They're outside. Do they make Birchas Kohanim? Yeah. Says the Gemara, who do they say the Birchas Kohanim for? They say the Birchas Kohanim la'acheim shebesados. There are acheim shebesados. Like, unfortunately, in our case, many Yidden didn't go to shul because they weren't able to come to shul. Just like there were brethren Yidden who were in the fields and they couldn't make it to shul, they're anusim. Al derech zeh nebuch, a lot of Yidden were on lockdown, quarantine for health reasons or for safety reasons. They're at home, they didn't go to shul, they can't go to shul. So therefore, the Birchas Kohanim in the shul relates to them. It's also, it bestows, the bracha is bestowed upon them even though you're in your house. Interesting, the Alter Rebbe proves from that the ponim keneged ponim is not essential because the Am Shebesados aren't facing the shul face to face, the Kohanim. So from there we see it's not essential. That's what the Alter Rebbe says, an interesting point of the Alter Rebbe, which he writes in brackets, and the Rebbe says the Alter Rebbe is mesupik and questions this point. But whatever, let's move on. Take a listen carefully. Guess what? Rabbi Simcha says When the Kohanim, there's only 10 Kohanim in the shul, and they're saying the Birchas Kohanim, and it's an empty shul. Imagine the great synagogue, or the Yerushalayim, the shul. What do you call that shul in Yerushalayim? The massive shul. Imagine 10 Kohanim. It's a leidik. Nebach. So in Europe, shul, yeah? Anyway, let's move. And you hear the echo. Do they have to say it b'kol ram, or they can say it silently? There's no one to talk to. Says Rabbi Simcha. Listen to what Rabbi Simcha says. The afal pisha beis hakneses kula koyanim, v'kulan oilin leduchan, ulamim mevarchin lachem shebesodes deloi sham meklal klal. The people who aren't the shul don't hear it at all. Mikol makayim boy sheyeh b'kol ram kadam ayim lachaveiroi. Rabbi Simcha says it's a given that if in your shul, no one's in shul, you bang the bracha l'am shebesodes. Yeah, nevertheless, the halacha of b'kol ram applies. You have to say b'kol ram. In other words, he accepts to say, and he says, "Uborulani is that? It's pashut in my eyes." In other words, he says, therefore, the case of the Levim is a different case than Birchas Kohanim. The kol ram of Birchas Kohanim of the Levim is for people to hear, because they have to answer amen, because it's a guide for them. If they don't hear, they're not going to get the message. But to get a bracha, you can get a bracha even if the guy's not in front of you, and even if he doesn't hear you. If you say l'chaim, I say l'chaim now for Klal Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael doesn't hear the bracha halavai, should be nimshach on Klal Yisrael. Amen l'chaim. Definitely, it's stronger and mightier if it's face to face. But I'll call upon him. We see a case that you have to say the bracha b'kol ram even though no one's in shul. That's the opinion of Rabbi Simcha. So he names on to say, it's very clear from that statement that he says the kol ram of Birchas Kohanim is basically a gather. It's a style. It's a surah of the bracha. If you don't say it b'kol ram, even if no one's there, there's something lacking. It's not a Birchas Kohanim, it's a bracha b'alma. Clear from Rabbi Simcha. Interestingly, let me share this with you. It's also a nefesh horav. Would you believe it? Rav Moshe Soloveitchik was also under that impression. He also had that shita. I don't want to say under other impression. That's wrong to say. I'm sorry. With the fullest respect. So the Rav Soloveitchik, Olav Hashalom from Boston, I believe it's from him. So he brings that Rav Moshe Soloveitchik said, yes, that the shir is tolui in how many people listen. Yeah, whatever. In other words, how do you set the tone? The kol ram. So he says, if there are 10 people, you have to say it enough that 10 people are able to hear. If there are more than 10 people, you have to raise your voice that all of the people should be able to hear. And this is basically found in the Pri Chadash. He queries if you need just for 10 or you need it for more than 10. The Ma'aseh B'Peil, it seems like a machlekes between the Pri Chadash and the Bach. The halacha is like the Mishnah Berurah records, and so is mashma for the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. If you have a big crowd in the shul, you have to raise your voice even louder. But listen to what it says further in the Nefesh Horav. On page Kuf Lamed Gimel, it says, listen carefully. We need kula koyanim. No one else is in the shul. You need sheyagbiu kolam ba'oifin shekozeh. They have to raise their voice in such a mode that if the people would have been in front of them, they all would be able to hear. So he connects it to the ones who are able. That's the way you measure the level of the koil. That's only a measure, but nevertheless you have to say b'koil ram. Now I want to say. That's just that point. But going back to Rabbi Simcha now mainly, because it's very clear that in the Likutei Torah of Parshas Nosoi, according to the Rav Soloveitchik, Hilav Dafka will follow with what we continue on saying. I want to talk to Rabbi Simcha Benigud in contrast to the Rogatchover Gaon. And it's very late. So Rabbi Simcha, because Rabbi Simcha says that the Koil Ram is a gather in the voice, right? In the words, in the tone. Therefore, it's identical to all, and therefore he takes it for granted. He says, if the Rambam, and that may be also the Shita to a degree, that if we need Kol Ram, so we need everything else to make it a Bal Toisif. If we don't need Kol Ram, we don't need anything else. And we're over Bal Toisif, so we don't need anything else. And the question is, what's the marker, like he asks? Listen to how the Rogatchover learns. And I'm going to share with you this Rogatchover, number one, from the new Sefer, and also from his other Sforim. The Rogatchover treats this. It's in the Rotzofnas Paneach al HaRambam, and in Hilchas Tefillah on this Rambam. Bal derech zeh, like I say in the new published Tzofnes Paneach HaMesechta Sukkah, Daf Kuf, Omot Kuf Chav Ches in the book, and that is Daf Mem Ches, where he addresses and analyzes it just this way. And it's also found in other Sforim of the Rambam, in Kuntras Hashloma of the Rambam, and in the Rambam in Kilayim, and in Trumas, etc., in many places. Listen to what the Rogatchover says. Listen to what the Rogatchover says. The Rogatchover has a shita which is just the opposite of Rameir Simcha. The Rogatchover Gaon claims, number one, he says, when the Gemara says, Amar lohem ka'adam sha'omer lechaveiro. You have to say it b'koil ram, a loud voice. So b'koil ram means ka'adam sha'omer lechaveiro. That's what the Gemara says, like a person speaking to his friend. Then he says, look in Talmud Yerushalmi, where the Talmud Yerushalmi says that koil ram means a koil me'ule, a pleasant koil. Dainu beinuni. You don't have to yell. So even though ram sounds like a loud voice, no, it's a pleasant voice. And like the Bach explains, I'm just embellishing a little what the Rogatchover says. It doesn't say koil godol, a loud voice, a mighty voice. It says koil ram. He says it's miloshan roimim mois keil begroinam becheres befis biyodam. It should be with a melody, so to speak, a pleasant koil beinuni. That's nishrayin. And he then brings a sifri. That means, in other words, in the text of the Shas, we're not very sure what the Shas means when it says you should say B'koil ram ka'adam ha'omer lechaveiro. Now the Rogatchover then brings the Talmud Yerushalmi, who explains, you know what B'koil ram means? It's a koil beinuni. Then he brings a sifri, which really is the key definition. Sifri says the reason why it has to be ka'adam ha'omer lechaveiro, says the sifri in Parshas Re'eh, Kedei sheyishmeu hakoil, in order that they all should hear. They actually have to hear the bracha. You gotta hear it. In other words, till now we learned according to Rameir Simcha, lav dafka, they have to hear it. But the Rogatchover says, based on this sifri, that he says, Amar lahem ka'adam sha'omer lechaveiro, says the Rogatchover, that's the meaning of ka'adam sha'omer lechaveiro. It doesn't just mean to say that it's the same tone. Ka'adam sha'omer lechaveiro means that he should hear it. Es darf nahangain in the gedern. Darf hören in the oren. He Pashat has to hear it. You can give a bracha to a yidin if even he doesn't hear it. But in this case, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says no. Koil ram, it's taka koil beinini, a koil me'ula, but it's ka'adam sha'omer lechaveiro. It has to be kedei sheyishma, his chaver should hear. So it's clear that the Rogatchover learns that the gather of the koil ram by Birchas Kohanim is different than all the other guidelines. All the other guidelines are a criteria in the mitzvah of the Birchas Kohanim, like the different cases the Rambam mentions. It has to be Bilshen Kodesh, it has to be Ba'amidah, it has to be B'nesiyas Kapayim. This is all at Siur in the Birchas Kohanim. If they're lacking, there's something lacking in the Birchas Kohanim. The reason why we need koil ram is not because if it's not koil ram, there's something lacking in the bracha. It has to be done in such a way in order to be able to, because Hashem wants the people to hear the bracha. And this may be appreciated, especially according to the Charedim. The Charedim say that the Charedim, the Chassam Sofer brings and the Mefarshei Shulchan Aruch bring, that the mitzvah is not just for the Kohanim to bless the people, the mitzvah is also for the people to be blessed. So b'meila, therefore, the mitzvah is also the Yisraelim as on sich zustellen. That's why you need panim keneged panim. So the same reason, it's important that they should also be recipients of the bracha. Nicht that they should, so to speak, turn their face away. Or they in the Bechlal don't hear it. No. It's because they have to hear it, because they are part and parcel of this bracha. It's one unit. It's one unit. Which actually in the Likutei Torah of the Nefesh Harav, the Rav Soloveitchik explains this point, that it has to become one unit. Therefore, the people have to hear it. Okay, but he goes on a different...
Is it Shemei Ka'ina?
No, let's not. No, Shomei Ka'ina by Birchas Kohanim. We spoke about that long ago. Let's not go there now. I'm sorry. Appreciate it. Thanks for the point. But let's go on. The man says the Rogatchover as follows. After the Rogatchover, based on that, so what's the meaning of the koil ram by the Levi? I have a feeling the Rogatchover says, look at the Toisif who asks the kasha why we don't derive it from the Levim. Possibly the Rogatchover wants to say that the reason why the Shas doesn't derive it from the Levim, because he interprets the case of the Levim different than the Rameir Simcha. The case of the Levim, it says it's B'Koil Ram. And then the Koil Ram means even louder than what the people can hear. That's the way the Rogatchover may have learned. And I found this interpretation in a sefer called Medrash Eliezer from a Rabbi Lezer Nochem, from a Bavuster commentary on the Sifri, quoted frequently by the Sifri de Rabbi, Rabbi David Pardo, and he brings him in Parshas Nosoi on the Sifri, and he taka says that if you learn it out from Koil Godol, from the Leviim, so then it comes out that they're really yelling their lungs out. It's so loud, it's even louder than what the people hear. And therefore he queries, what's the din by Birchas Kohanim? Maybe you really have to yell loudly. I see that based on that, there's room to argue that Dafka, the case of the Levium, is not like Rabbi Simcha understood, that the people have to get the message. It's more than that. It's actually a criteria in the Koil. Time doesn't allow to go into the details, so possibly the Rogatchover learned different in the case of the Levium also. But I'll call upon going back to the Birchas Kohanim. The Rogatchover goes on and says as follows. He says, just like we say, the nafkamina, says the Rogatchover, what's the nafkamina if I say that Birchas Kohanim, it's important that the recipients to hear it? Or if I say that's not the reason why it has to be B'Koil Ram, right? In other words, we have two ways to learn. Why does it have to be B'Koil Ram? Does it have to be B'Koil Ram because that's a criteria in the tone, in the bracha? Or is the reason Koil Ram is because the recipients have to hear it? Says the Rogatchover, I'm establishing based on the Yerushalmi, the Sifri, and that interprets the Shas. That's what the Shas also means, that it's an order for the recipients to be able to hear it. The people in the shul. What's the nafkamini, he says? An ear shekula koyanim. Here he brings that case. An ear shekula koyanim of Beis HaKnesses, where they're only koyanim. Who do they say the bracha for? The Am Shebesodis, the people who aren't in shul. Says the Rogatchover, they're not in shul. They don't hear the bracha at all. Even if you'll say it B'Koil Ram, they won't hear it. Isn't that correct? They're not in the shul. So if that's the case, says the Rogatchover, if I'll accept to say that the only reason HaKadosh Baruch Hu says you have to say it B'Koil Ram is in order for the people to hear it, then the same Shulchan Aruch says and the same Gemara says that when there's no one in the shul, you also have to say the bracha. So if the reason that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says when the people are in the shul, you got to say the bracha, is in order for the people to hear it, what happens in the case where there's no one in shul and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says you have to say the bracha? Says the Rogatchover, the nafkamina will be if you can say it silently. Says the Rogatchover, yes, you can say it balachash when there's no one in shul and you're saying lam shabesod is the bracha. You balde balavoch, you don't hear it, and the whole reason you have to say it aloud is not because you have to yell your lungs out. It's only for them to hear it. So however you'll raise your voice, they won't hear it anyway. So you don't have to say it loudly, you can say it silently. Different like Rabbi Meir Simcha, and different like Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, like I mentioned in Nefesh Harav. Again, because the whole reason we have to say it aloud is only for people to hear. Says the Rogatchover, if the halacha says that you have to say it for the people who are B'am Shabbat, and no one is in the shul, the Shulchan Aruch says you can say it even silently. So listen to this. I've seen certain Mefarshim say as follows. In the Sefer Yeshua's Malkoi, in the glosses, not in the glosses, it's a Hagois Ma'atzri, that Yeshua's Malkoi is from Rabbi Shila Kutna, but there are Hagois on the Rambam. At the end of the Sefer from the publisher, the one who published the Sefer Yeshua's Malkoi was a grandchild from the Yeshua's Malkoi of Rabbi Shila Kutna, who was a London on his own. So he says as a vort, I'll soon tell you what kind of word he says. Bal Toisif Harav Hutner says Al Derech the same thing in Pachad Yitzchak and Sefer HaZikaron. Bal Toisif Pomeranchik says the same thing in his Chibur, which is called Emek Bracha. But listen what they all want to say. They say as follows. They all accept to say that if no one's in the shul, you don't have to say it loudly, you can say it silently. But maybe they say, Vibald, I find a halacha in Birchas Kohanim, that you can say it silently. But therefore, that's the mocker for the Rambam to say that even if the Kohen says the fourth bracha balachash, you are over by Bal Toisif, because we find by Birchas Kohanim that we can perform the mitzvah even when it's balachash. But I want to say what they're saying is not good enough, because maybe that's only good that they're not in shul. But who said that applies even when the people are in shul? And who says that's a permit, etc., etc., across the board? Listen to how the Rogatchover learns this halacha. This is a chiddush of the Rogatchover, what he takes out and he extrapolates or deduces from this din. He says when there's no one in shul, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says you have to make the bracha, is a bavai. Why? Because there's no one who's going to hear it anyway. The Mela says the Rogatchover, listen to what the Rogatchover says. What do we know? We see from this that in something which doesn't have to be heard, when it's said silently, it's not a problem. It's not a psul. In other words, when you have to say it aloud, because people are in shul, you have to hear it. So therefore, if you say it silently, not becoming the mitzvah. But from the Am Shebesodos, that case, I see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, say the Birchas Kohanim silently, because even if you say it aloud, no one's there. What do I derive from this? A principle, says the Rogatchover. That's the sheet of the Rogatchover. It's his perspective of all the halachas. He's going to derive a yesod. What is the yesod? He says, from this din I have a yesod. That where it doesn't have to be heard, so then when you say it silently, it's not a psul. There's nothing lacking in the mitzvah. I see it from Birchas Kohanim, from Shebesodos. I can say it silently because they don't hear it. There's not a problem because they don't need to hear it. So where they don't need to hear it and they're not able to hear it, then the saying it silently is not a problem. Says the Rogatchover. The same goes for the fourth bracha. That's the mucker of the Rambam. The principle is the same. The fourth bracha no one has to hear. Listen to what the Rogatchover said. The three brachas they have to hear because that's mitzvah's Birchas Kohanim. The bracha which this Kohen wants to add on his own, which is the Bal Toisif, no one has to hear. So it's mamish like the case of the Yidden, who is the Kohanim who are making the bracha for the Am Shebesodos. Where they don't have to hear it, the lachash is not a psul in the Birchas Kohanim. So the fourth bracha, the people don't have to hear the fourth bracha. They don't have to hear the fourth bracha, so therefore by saying silently, it's not a psul in the Amiras HaBracha. If it's not a psul in the Amiras HaBracha, so it's begeder Birchas Kohanim. If it's begeder Birchas Kohanim, so you're Bal Toisif. And dafka, the way the Rogatchover approaches it and analyzes it, it makes sense and it makes no difference. We can also derive from that din even to a place where the people are in shul and the Kohen is adding this fourth bracha. Nevertheless, if he says it silently, he will be able to Bal Toisif based on this yesod and this principle. The Rogatchover uses this principle in his new sefer on Masechta Sukkah to explain a Toisvis in relation to schach posel, and he says this is a yesod and a formula has nothing to do with Bal Toisif. It has to do with the geder hadvarim without the geder of Bal Toisif. This is the yesod. That where something is not needed, so where it's lacking, it's not a psul. So where it's not needed, where it's lacking, it's not a psul. So it's not the geder Bal Toisif. I'll call upon him based on the Rogatchover Gaon. Shittas Rambam is dafka in such a case. That's why he explains the Rambam. So that's why the Rambam says Bekel Ram, based on whatever we said, means. So even though the Rambam says the Lashon Kol Ram, it sounds like you always have to say it loudly. No, Kol Ram, like the Achronim say, he quotes the Lashon of the Gemara, Kol Ram. But it doesn't mean mamish loudly. It means loud enough for people to hear. Therefore, but Hana meaning when they have to hear. But we don't have to hear, you can even say it silently. You even whisper it. And therefore, if you even whisper it, because they don't have to hear, so you'll be able to Bal Toisif. So according to the Rogatchover Gaon, the Das Rambam, he chose dafka this as an example. Because only in this case, only in such a case of Kol Ram and Balachash, that's where you'll be able to Bal Toisif. But if you're lacking all the other principles, you won't be able to Bal Toisif. And that's why, according to that, he definitely doesn't learn like Rameir Simcha. He definitely doesn't learn like the Mishnah Brura. And there's no machlokes between the Rambam and the Ritva. The Rambam says a special new principle, and therefore the Rambam paskins this halach only because Ram. And I believe that with this, where it's time to end, right? It's time to end. So Lamaisel Bapel in Mane Eliyahu, interesting. From the Aderes, the Mane Eliyahu, he agrees in principle with the Mishnah Brura. What in Bir Alocha that he raised this issue and he seems to have a problem with this Rambam. He Lamaisa at the end wants to reconcile. He says there's no machlokes between the Rambam and the Ritva and the Rashba because he says we're not talking about giving Malkus. We're talking about the Isur of Chatzi Shir. He says of Chatzi Shir of Bal Toisif. There's a din of Chatzi Shir of Bal Toisif. So even though there's no Mamish Malkus, nevertheless, there'll be a Geder of Bal Toisif. B'meili, he says, according to the Rambam, it could be all the Inyanim if you're lacking. There'll be an Isur, even though the Rambam just chose this example, right? And according to the other Mefarshim, if they're lacking, according to the Rambam, there'll be about Toisif by all of them. And the other Rishonim will hold that if you're missing all of them, each one will agree to the other one, I'll call Ponim, in relation to the Bal Toisif, Bekesha to Malkus, there won't be, but Bekesha to an Isur, there will be. That's the way he has his reconciliation, his take, which is more like a Lamdisha take, a different kind of take, but the Rogatchover has his approach based on his analysis. I hope you appreciate it and you picked up and got what the Rogatchover says. I'm thinking about it for days, so therefore I do appreciate it. I hope you do appreciate it and you got it. And if you didn't think about it, because now you have an opportunity to listen to the recording, so listen to it over and over again. And with this, we conclude this Inyan, and may HaKadosh Baruch Hu give Taka that the bracha, just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu benches the Am Yisrael and benches the Kohanim in sequence to their bracha, is Kol HaMevorach Mizborech. So definitely, like we said, that even those who didn't get a chance to come to shul, the Am Shebesodes, all the Eden were at home, had the Birchas Kohanim. So may it be that Hashem should give us the Yevoracha. By the way, this has all of what we discussed today has implications, and this is raised already by the Hart Tzvi in the Shailas Achuvis, and raised also by the Aderes in his Shailas Achuvis, in relation to, in the Man Eliyahu, in relation to the brachas which the Kohanim give after they brought, you see, Asher Koyach Kohen. And then the Kohen says, what do I say? No? Baruch Tiyeh, Bruchen Tihiyu. Baruch Tiyeh, Bruchen Tihiyu. So is there a Shaila of a fourth bracha? So it depends very much on how we're going to learn all this in Yonim. You can learn simple that if they only say it B'loshen Shel Tefillah, they're saying it B'loshen Shel Bracha, but it's not with Nesiyas Kapayim, or it's not Ponim Keneged Ponim. It is Ponim Keneged Ponim. But I'll call Ponim Yibal, that's in a different stage. According to the Rogatchover Gaon, there's another tshuva of the Rogatchover Gaon in Shailas Achuvis Varsha, where there he says that by the Kohen turning his face to the other side, when he says the Hashkifa, when he says the Yiratzon, it's as if they're changing the place. They're moving from their place. And he brings from the Gemara in Masechta Kedushin and in Masechta Psachim that by Bimahader Ape, by turning your face, it says you're moving from room to room. That's according to one man, the Omar. The male, if that's the case, he says that's the reason they turn their face away. It should be regarded as if they're going from a different area. So there's no Shaila Bal Toisif, which according to that, it wouldn't be a problem if they walk off from their original place where they said the Birchas Kohanim, and they're walking through the shul and they say Baruch Tiyu, Bruchen Tiyu. That wouldn't be a problem according to the Rogatchover going to Pashtus. Others want to say, according to the Hart Tzvi, he says you have to refrain from saying the Baruch Tiyu. It could be a problem. At least there may be an Isur, even though possibly it's not essential. The Panim Keneged Panim L'dasa Balatanya, but he says therefore there can be an Isur, Shailas, and Yonim. So based on all the different shittas we explained, we can appreciate to see exactly all these Shailas in this context. Seid alle gesund, Baruch Tiyu, Bruchen Tiyu. Soll sein, Emes and Birchas Kohanim in the Binzel Zeichas, and let us all be Zeicha to the Birchas Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi, Taka with the Shem HaMefurish, and we should all Taka be Zeicha to the being of Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi. Have a wonderful Yontif. The Rogatchover says that you may have Tashlumim. I believe even those who say Tachlum. I'm sorry for meeting Ashkenaz who are going to say Tachlum tomorrow, but if you recall, we once had a shir that the Ashkenazim also have an issue. Some of the Gdolei Chachmei Ashkenaz claim that we shouldn't say Tachlum. So b'meila, I'm not going to tell you to change your minig. So those who say it, and those who don't say it is Tovei Alechem Brocha. You have to follow like the Sfardim. The Sfardim definitely don't say Tachlum v'me'at Tashlumin. That's the Pri Chodesh and the Knesset Hagdolah, the Balatanya Paskins like that in the Siddur. So therefore, we don't say Tachlum v'me'at Tashlumin. So this is v'me'at Tashlumin. So even though there's no Tashlumin for Simcha, but there's a Hemshech of Yom Tif, so and the Rogatchover Paskins that the v'me'at Tashlumin are ke'en Yom Tif. Is like alle gesund, l'chaim.